Hey, welcome back. My friend, tonight. Imagine that the room around you has grown very quiet. The lights are low, somewhere beyond the walls. Perhaps there is traffic moving in the distance, rain touching a window, or simply the soft nighttime hum of a place settling down. Now picture another sound, dry grass brushing against your ankles. You are standing beneath an enormous African sky roughly 80,000 years ago. The evening air is cooling against your skin. Smoke drifts from a small fire nearby, carrying the smell of burning wood and roasted food. Someone shifts a stone beside the flames. A child murmurs sleepily. Far beyond the glow, insects pulse through the darkness. There are no roads here, no cities, no written names for the people around you. Before you settle beside their fire, make yourself comfortable where you are, let your shoulders loosen, allow your breathing to slow, and if these quiet journeys through history help you unwind, you can leave a like or subscribe. Your support helps these long, gentle stories continue. You can also tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is there. For now, the fire is waiting. You move closer. The first thing you notice about 80,000 years ago is how strangely familiar everything feels. Not the landscape. Perhaps, depending on exactly where in Africa you have arrived, you might find open grassland, woodland, rocky country, river valleys, or a coastal environment where the smell of salt travels inland with the breeze. But the people themselves would surprise you. The humans sitting around this fire are members of Homo sapiens. They are your species. Anatomically, modern humans had already existed in Africa for a very long time by this point. Fossils associated with early Homo sapiens extend much farther into the past than 80,000 years, with evidence showing that our species emerged through a complex evolutionary history within Africa. So you have not arrived among creatures slowly becoming human. You have arrived among humans. That distinction matters. A woman sitting near the fire turns a piece of food in the heat. Another person examines the edge of a stone tool. A child watches both activities with the kind of silent concentration children still display. When adults are doing something, they are absolutely determined to imitate later. Nobody is thinking about being prehistoric. That would be rather inconvenient. For them, this is simply tonight. Their world contains no written history because writing will not appear for tens of thousands of years. Agriculture is also unimaginably distant. There are no governments collecting taxes, which may sound briefly appealing until you remember there are also no hospitals, supermarkets, mattresses, or refrigerators. Everything necessary for tomorrow must come from knowledge, cooperation, memory, and the surrounding landscape. You lower yourself near the fire. The ground feels firm beneath you. Perhaps there are hides, grasses, or other plant materials arranged around the camp to make resting slightly more comfortable. Nothing resembles the soft bed waiting in your own world. But prehistoric people were not necessarily sleeping directly on bare dirt every night. Archaeological evidence from later and some very ancient sites suggests that humans sometimes deliberately prepared sleeping areas using grasses and other vegetation. A bed, it turns out, is an extremely old idea. The luxury mattress came considerably later. You run your fingers over dry vegetation near your resting place. It smells faintly dusty and sweet. The fire warms one side of your body while the evening cools the other around you. Conversation continues. You cannot understand a word. In fact, nobody today can tell you exactly what language sounded like 80,000 years ago. Language leaves no fossilized sentences behind. Bones can survive. Stone tools can survive. Pigments can survive. Unfortunately, casual conversation does not preserve nearly as well. Researchers continue to question exactly when language reached the complexity familiar to modern humans. Some argue that sophisticated communication must have deep evolutionary roots. while others are more cautious about identifying particular archaeological objects as proof of fully modern language. You listen anyway. One person makes a short sound, another responds. A hand gestures toward the darkness. Several heads turn, whatever the precise structure of their speech. Communication clearly matters in a world where cooperation can mean the difference between eating and going hungry. The darkness beyond camp is becoming deeper now. This is another difference you feel immediately. Modern nighttime is rarely completely dark. Even if you switch off every lamp in your room, light often leaks through curtains or beneath doors. Streetlights glow. Screens wake at a touch. A tiny charging indicator can somehow illuminate half a bedroom when you're trying to sleep. Here, darkness is genuine. The fire creates a small island of orange light. Beyond it, the landscape disappears. Your eyes gradually adjust. Stars become startlingly bright overhead. The Milky Way stretches across the sky without competition from electric light. You can see why generations of humans would eventually fill the heavens with stories. But tonight, the people beside you may be watching the sky for practical reasons too. Weather matters. Season matters. The movement of animals matters. Water matters most of all. These people live within environments that can change dramatically over generations. Around this broad period, Africa experienced shifting climatic conditions that repeatedly altered lakes, rivers, vegetation, and migration routes. A place generous enough to support a group for years might become less dependable. Rainfall patterns could move. Animals could follow new grazing grounds. Water sources could shrink. Humans had to respond. And this is one of the central realities of the enormous stretch of history you're entering. People moved, not constantly, and not randomly. A group might return repeatedly to familiar places because those places offered water, stones suitable for tools, edible plants, shellfish, game, shelter, or seasonal resources. Knowledge of such locations could become part of collective memory. An older person might know where water remains during a dry period. Another might recognize when a particular plant is safe to eat. Someone else may remember where good stone can be collected. There are no guidebooks. The guidebook is sitting beside you, and much of it is probably stored in the minds of people who have spent decades watching the same landscapes change. That may be one of the easiest things to underestimate about prehistoric life. Knowledge is technology. Knowing when to move can be as important as owning a sharp tool. Knowing which route contains food and which one makes you desperately regret your curiosity is useful information indeed. You notice a small object near the fire. Perhaps it is a piece of ochre. Mineral pigments such as ochre appear at prehistoric African sites, and some evidence indicates humans were collecting, processing, or using pigments long before the famous painted caves of later Ice Age Europe. This is one of those lesser-known details that quietly changes the picture. The deep past was not simply grey stone and brown animal hide. People interacted with colour. Ochre could have practical uses, but it may also have been used symbolically or decoratively. Exactly what particular pieces meant is harder to determine. Some archaeologists interpret early pigment use and engraved materials as evidence of symbolic behaviour. Others warn that meaning cannot automatically be reconstructed from objects alone. A red mineral fragment does not come with an explanatory label. Prehistory is inconsiderate like that. Still, you can imagine fingers stained with pigment. You can imagine someone noticing the intense colour against skin. You can imagine curiosity. The fire settles lower. A person places another branch into the glowing centre, and sparks rise briefly before vanishing. You begin to understand how misleading the word primitive can be. Nothing here is simple to the people living it. They understand relationships you do not. Tracks in dust, changes in wind, animal calls, plants at different seasons. Stone hidden inside an ordinary-looking rock, the behavior of relatives, the intentions of neighboring groups, the safest route toward water. You possess knowledge they could never imagine. But if everyone suddenly walked away and left you alone here, your impressive modern education might become less useful surprisingly quickly. You might know the Earth travels around the sun. Excellent. Now find breakfast. The thought is gently humbling. Someone near you lies down. Another remains awake beside the fire. The camp gradually becomes quieter, and as you sit beneath the stars, you realize that written history has trained us to notice certain things. Kings, wars, cities, monuments, dates. But none of those exist here. Human history is already happening anyway. It is happening through small choices. Someone sharing food, someone remembering a path, someone teaching a child, someone carrying a useful stone back to camp, someone keeping the fire alive while others sleep. Thousands of generations will live like this before anyone writes their name. Most will leave no individual trace that archaeologists can ever recover. Yet their decisions will continue forward. Tomorrow, you will stay with this small band and discover what life feels like when survival is not an individual adventure, but something created quietly between people. For tonight, you remain beside their fire. Smoke rises into the enormous darkness. Voices become softer, and somewhere beyond the circle of light, an animal calls once across the sleeping landscape. The animal call fades into the darkness, and for a while nobody beside the fire seems particularly concerned. That is reassuring. You remain where you settled earlier, surrounded by sleeping bodies, warm ash, dry grass, and the faint smell of smoke caught in everything around you. The night has cooled further. A light breeze moves across the camp, touching your face before disappearing into the grass. Someone near the edge of the fire turns in their sleep. A child shifts closer to an adult. Another person quietly adjusts a piece of wood over the embers. These movements seem ordinary, almost insignificant, yet they reveal one of the most important facts about human life 80,000 years ago. You're not surviving alone. The image of prehistoric humans wandering individually through dangerous wilderness is convenient for films, but real human survival has always depended heavily on cooperation. Homo sapiens is a deeply social species. Food can be shared. Children can be watched by more than one adult. Knowledge can pass between generations. Danger can be noticed by several pairs of eyes. Injury or illness does not necessarily mean immediate abandonment. You begin to realize that the group surrounding you is more than company. It is part of the survival system. Morning arrives slowly. There is no alarm. Although a bird somewhere nearby appears enthusiastic about applying for the position, the darkness turns grey. Shapes emerge around you. You can finally see the camp more clearly. It is not a village. There are no permanent houses arranged along neat paths. There is no central square, no fence, and certainly no convenient little shop selling breakfast. Instead, you see a temporary living place. The exact form would depend heavily on environment and season. Some early humans used caves or rock shelters when available. Others occupied open sites, probably creating temporary shelters from branches, vegetation, hides, or whatever useful materials the landscape offered. You stretch your legs. The ground beneath your sleeping place has preserved some warmth from the bodies resting there. Nearby, several people are already awake. One adult checks the remains of the fire. Another moves towards stored objects and tools. Children begin stirring, and almost immediately, the camp becomes social. A younger child approaches someone who may not be a parent and receives attention without ceremony. That small interaction matters. Human childhood is unusually long. Compared with many animals, human children remain dependent for years. They require food, protection, teaching, and patience. Occasionally in heroic quantities, anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies have often emphasized cooperative childcare. Although arrangements vary widely between cultures, the deeper evolutionary history of this behavior is difficult to reconstruct precisely. But shared care may have played an important role in human social development. You watch the child move between adults. Nobody gives a lecture about cooperation. They simply cooperate. This is how most important human behaviors probably entered history. Quietly, repeatedly, without anyone realizing that future researchers would become extremely interested in them. The camp begins preparing for the day. Some people may leave to gather plants, shellfish, honey, insects, eggs, or other resources depending on the region. Others may search for animals, collect firewood, repair tools, process food, or remain closer to younger children. Modern assumptions can tempt you to divide every task into rigid categories. Men do one thing, women do another. Reality was probably more complicated. Researchers continue to debate how labor was divided among prehistoric hunter-gatherers, especially because archaeological remains rarely reveal exactly who performed a particular task. Studies of recent and historically documented foraging societies show considerable variation. Age matters, skill matters, season matters, opportunity matters, local tradition matters, human beings, as usual, refuse to organize themselves neatly for the convenience of future textbooks. You follow several people toward the edge of camp. One carries a stone tool, another has something that may help transport gathered materials. The children who come along are not simply passengers, they're watching. This may be one of the most important activities happening anywhere in the landscape. Learning. There are no schools, no notebooks, no written instructions. Yet the amount of information a child must acquire is enormous. Which plants are edible? Where does water remain during dry periods? How do you approach certain animals? Which snakes deserve distance? What does a particular bird call indicate? How do you recognize suitable stone? When does a fruit ripen? Where can shellfish be collected safely? How do you maintain a fire? Who belongs to your group? Who lives beyond it? You might spend years learning answers that adults around you carry almost automatically. An older person stops beside a plant. Hands move through its leaves. A younger person watches. Perhaps something is dug from the soil. There is no formal lesson. The lesson is happening anyway. A curious detail from studies of traditional foraging communities is just how much children's learning can occur through observation. Imitation, play, and gradual participation rather than constant direct instruction. A child may begin with something that looks like play and slowly become competent. You can imagine miniature versions of adult tasks. Small hands collecting, small hands carrying, small hands attempting to shape materials, small hands making mistakes, probably quite a few mistakes, fortunately. Childhood has always included experienced adults saying, in one form or another, "Perhaps do not put that in your mouth." You continue walking. The sun rises higher. Heat begins replacing the coolness of morning. Your companions seem to notice details you completely miss. One pauses at disturbed soil, another studies marks on the ground. You see dirt, they see information. This difference reminds you that intelligence is not merely knowing facts, it is recognizing patterns relevant to your world. Back at camp later. Food begins arriving from different directions. Not everyone returns with equal amounts. That is normal. Foraging is uncertain. One person's success can compensate for another person's poor day. Food sharing, therefore, becomes especially important among many documented hunter-gatherer societies. Sharing helps distribute risk across households and individuals. The exact rules vary, but cooperation can make unpredictable resources more dependable at the group level. Imagine trying to survive if everyone guarded every calorie personally. One unlucky day would become dangerous. Several unlucky days could become disastrous. Sharing creates a kind of social insurance long before anyone invents insurance paperwork, which is perhaps one of humanity's better early administrative decisions. You sit again near the camp. Someone passes food. You receive a portion. It may be plant food, cooked meat, or something collected nearby. You chew slowly. The flavor is unfamiliar. There is smoke in it. Perhaps grit, too. Prehistoric dining rarely includes complaints to the chef. Across the camp, an older individual sits near younger members of the group. Their presence makes you think about another important question. How long did people live? You sometimes hear that prehistoric humans rarely survived beyond 30. That is misleading. Average life expectancy at birth could be low largely because infant and childhood mortality were high. People who survived childhood could sometimes live for many decades. Older adults therefore existed within prehistoric communities, and their accumulated experience may have been extremely valuable. Some scholars suggest that longer adult lifespans strengthened cultural transmission because grandparents and other experienced individuals could preserve knowledge across generations. Others remain cautious about exactly when such demographic patterns became widespread. Still, you can see the advantage immediately. Imagine a drought occurring only once every 20 years. A young adult may never have experienced one. An older person might remember too. Memory becomes a resource. You look at the faces around you differently now. Each person carries invisible information. A route, a technique, a relationship, a story, a warning, perhaps even a joke repeated so often that everyone has heard it far too many times. Some things may truly be timeless. As afternoon begins softening toward evening, the group gathers more closely again. Children become quieter. Tools are checked. Food is processed. The fire receives fresh fuel. You recognize the rhythm now. People separate during parts of the day, but they repeatedly return to one another. The group expands and contracts like breathing, and gradually, another thought becomes clear. Humanity's great advantage was never simply strength. You are not the fastest animal here. You do not have claws. Your teeth are unimpressive compared with the large predators. Your skin provides little protection. Even your children require years before becoming independent. Alone. You seem almost poorly designed for this landscape. Together, everything changes. One person remembers, another watches, another carries, another gathers, another shapes stone, another tends the fire, another comforts a child. And tonight, when darkness returns and the familiar stars appear overhead, you no longer see a collection of individuals sitting around a flame. You see a network. Tomorrow, that network will move outward across the landscape again, and you will follow it into a world without signs, roads, or maps, where every footprint and broken branch may have something to say. The familiar stars gradually fade as morning returns, and once again the camp begins to stir before the sun has fully cleared the horizon. You're learning that nobody needs a clock here. Morning announces itself through temperature, light, birdsong, and movement. The air is pleasantly cool against your face, somewhere nearby. Dry stems rustle beneath careful footsteps. A bird repeats the same short call from a tree until another answers farther away. You rise with several members of the group. Today, you're going farther from camp. That sounds simple until you remember one inconvenient detail. There are no maps, no road signs, no painted arrows, no helpful blue dot informing you that your destination is 17 minutes away. Instead, the landscape itself must be read. For humans living 80,000 years ago, Detailed environmental knowledge was essential. Hunter-gatherers depended on understanding the locations and seasonal availability of water, plants, animals, stone, shelter, and other resources. This knowledge was not optional trivia, it was part of staying alive. You follow the others through open country. At first, you concentrate mainly on keeping your footing. The ground changes constantly beneath you. Dry soil becomes loose stone, grass hides shallow depressions. Thorny plants seem remarkably interested in your clothing. Your companions move more comfortably. One person pauses. You stop too. There is something in the dust. You lean closer. Tracks. To you. They are dense. To the person beside you. They may contain an entire sequence of events. The shape can suggest what animal passed. Depth may offer clues about size or speed. Sharp edges can indicate freshness. Overlapping prints can reveal direction. Broken vegetation may add another piece. Traditional tracking knowledge documented among modern hunter-gatherers can be extraordinarily sophisticated, involving careful reasoning from subtle signs. Of course, you cannot assume that every prehistoric group used identical techniques. Still, tracking almost certainly has deep roots because hunting and avoiding dangerous animals both reward close attention. The tracker moves onward. You attempt to notice what they notice. You fail almost immediately. A twig is bent. Apparently this matters. A patch of soil looks darker. That matters too. There is a faint mark beside a stone. You would have walked directly over it. You begin feeling like someone who has been handed a book written in an alphabet. Everyone understands except you. The landscape is full of sentences. You simply cannot read them yet. A little later, the group changes direction. There is no discussion you can interpret. Perhaps someone has recognized a distant landmark. Humans can navigate using rivers, ridgelines, mountains, coastlines, vegetation zones, stars, prevailing winds, and remembered sequences of terrain. Routes can also be preserved socially through stories and repeated journeys. Researchers still question exactly how far particular prehistoric groups regularly travelled and how detailed their mental maps were, since mobility varied greatly between environments. Yet stone provides intriguing clues. Archaeologists sometimes find raw materials far from their geological sources. Such discoveries can indicate direct travel, exchange between groups, or movement through several social networks. A stone can therefore carry a hidden geography. You look at the tool in someone's hand. Perhaps the material came from nearby. Perhaps it travelled farther than you have today. There's no way to ask. So you keep walking. The sun rises. Heat gathers across the ground. Eventually you reach a place where vegetation becomes greener. That alone feels meaningful. Then you hear insects. A moment later, water appears. It is not a grand river. It may be a spring, pool, stream, or seasonal water source. The group approaches carefully. Water attracts more than humans. Animals need it too. Some of those animals are useful prey. Others may regard you as a possible meal, which is less convenient. You crouch. The mud near the edge is covered in tracks. Here, the landscape has become a notice board. Hooves, bird feet, perhaps impressions from larger animals. Some are fresh, others have softened. You imagine generations learning this place, a parent showing a child where to approach, an older person remembering that the pool shrinks during dry years, someone knowing another source beyond the ridge if this one disappears. This accumulated environmental knowledge can transform an apparently wild landscape into something closer to home. That idea is important. When modern people imagine wilderness, they often imagine emptiness. But people who know a landscape intimately, it is not empty at all. It is organized by memory. There are good trees, bad crossings, reliable springs, seasonal foods, useful rocks, dangerous places, sheltered sleeping areas, paths animals prefer, locations connected to people and events. You drink. The water is cool. For a moment, everyone rests. Then one person points toward a tree. You notice birds moving around it. That may seem trivial. But animal behavior can reveal information about the environment. Birds can indicate water, fruiting plants, insects, predators, or other resources. Experienced foragers often pay attention not only to what they see directly, but to what other species are doing. A quirky example from ethnographic tracking traditions is that skilled trackers can sometimes infer surprisingly specific events from indirect clues, including how insects, birds, or disturbed vegetation behave around tracks. It is almost detective work without the dramatic music. You continue onward. Clouds have begun forming in the distance. Someone looks up repeatedly. You do too, naturally. The clouds tell you nothing beyond the revolutionary observation that there may eventually be weather. Your companions may notice more: wind direction, humidity, cloud shape, animal behavior, and seasonal patterns can all become useful indicators when people spend their lives outdoors. There is another kind of map here as well: sound. You hear birds before seeing them. You hear movement in vegetation. Calls travel across open ground. At night, animal sounds may reveal what is active beyond the firelight. Even silence can matter. If familiar sounds suddenly stop, attention follows. You begin listening more carefully. The world grows larger when your ears join your eyes. By afternoon, you're tired. The group turns back. You wonder how anyone remembers the route. Nothing looks familiar. Then you notice that your companions do not retrace every step exactly. They appear to understand the broader shape of the country. A ridge becomes visible. A particular cluster of trees appears. The angle of the sun has changed. One landmark leads toward another. You realize that a mental map does not require a bird's-eye view printed on paper. It can be a chain of remembered relationships. Walk toward that ridge. Past the rocky ground, keep the low hills to one side, find the trees, follow the drainage. Home appears. You eventually smell smoke. It reaches you before the camp becomes visible. That scent is suddenly comforting. A few minutes later, voices carry through the vegetation. You have returned. People who stayed behind look up. Food and materials are brought together. Information probably returns too. Where animals were seen, where plants were ready, where the water remained plentiful, where the tracks from other humans appeared. The landscape is continuously being updated inside the group's collective memory. Tonight, as you settle near the same fire, you understand something you did not understand yesterday. These people do not wander blindly through an unknown wilderness. They inhabit a known world. Their map is simply invisible to you. It exists in footsteps, stories, habits, landmarks, scars on trees, remembered seasons, and the minds of people sitting nearby. Tomorrow, you will discover what all this knowledge is ultimately used to find: food. Not the romantic prehistoric feast of imagination, but the ordinary daily work of gathering enough energy to keep everyone moving through another day. Morning finds you thinking about food. This is hardly surprising. Yesterday's journey across the landscape taught you where water might be found, how tracks could be read, and how much information could hide inside something as ordinary as a bent stem. Today, all of that knowledge has a practical purpose: breakfast. The fire has burned low during the night. A thin ribbon of smoke rises from grey ash, carrying the familiar scent that now seems permanently attached to the camp. Someone stirs the embers. Another person sorts through what remains from yesterday's food. There is no pantry to open, no cupboard, no cereal waiting patiently in a cardboard box. Whatever the group eats must ultimately come from the surrounding environment, and obtaining it occupies a large part of human life. At roughly 80,000 years ago, every human population lives by hunting and gathering. Agriculture will not begin for tens of thousands of years. There are no domesticated fields producing predictable harvests, and no herds of livestock waiting beside permanent settlements. Instead, food arrives from many directions: plants, seeds, tubers, fruit, nuts, shellfish, eggs, insects, honey, fish, small animals, large animals when circumstances allow. Exactly what people eat depends enormously on where they live. You leave camp with several others. The morning is cool enough that walking feels pleasant. Sunlight catches the tops of grasses while the lower ground remains partly shaded. Soon, someone stops beside an unremarkable patch of vegetation. You would have walked past it, naturally, by now. You're becoming accustomed to the prehistoric landscape repeatedly demonstrating that it knows more than you do. A digging tool is used against the soil. The earth loosens. After a little work, something emerges from below, a root or tuber. Underground plant foods can provide valuable carbohydrates, although identifying exactly which plants prehistoric humans used is difficult because plant remains preserve poorly compared with stone and bone. This creates a strange distortion in archaeology. Stone survives beautifully. Dinner usually does not, for generations. This preservation problem helped make prehistoric diets appear more dominated by hunting than they may actually have been. More recent archaeological techniques can detect microscopic plant residues, starch grains, phytoliths, and other traces that reveal a broader menu. You watch several edible plants being collected. There is skill even in this quiet task. The wrong plant may be useless. Another may require cooking. Some may only be worth gathering during particular seasons. Others may contain edible parts hidden underground, while everything visible above looks thoroughly disappointing. Knowledge turns vegetation into food. Without knowledge, it is simply vegetation. Farther ahead, a child imitates an adult searching near the ground. The child finds something. It is inspected, apparently acceptable. Into the collection it goes. Nobody applauds. Yet another tiny lesson has been completed. The group moves toward a different patch of country. If you are near a coast or a large body of water, the menu can change dramatically. Archaeological sites in southern Africa show that humans were exploiting marine resources tens of thousands of years before your visit, including shellfish collected along shorelines. Imagine reaching such a coast. Salt hangs in the air, waves move rhythmically against rock. Pools left behind by the tide contain small worlds of their own. Shellfish may look like modest food, but they offer something extremely useful. They do not run away. This is an admirable quality in lunch. Collecting them still requires knowledge of tides, safe access points, seasons, and suitable species. But compared with pursuing a large frightened animal across difficult ground, a mussel is refreshingly cooperative. One lesser-known detail is that some ancient coastal communities may have timed visits to shorelines according to tidal cycles. Researchers studying Middle Stone Age sites have explored whether people understood these repeating marine patterns well enough to schedule shellfish gathering efficiently. The evidence invites fascinating possibilities, although reconstructing precise planning behavior from ancient shells remains difficult. You imagine watching the moonlit water change night after night. Patterns would eventually become familiar. The sea, like yesterday's tracks, can become another kind of calendar. Today, however, your companions continue inland. By late morning, you encounter signs of animals. Tracks cross the ground. Dung lies nearby. The group's attention changes. Movements become more deliberate. Hunting large animals is one possible source of concentrated calories. Fat, hides, bone, sinew, and other useful materials but it is also uncertain work. Popular images of prehistoric life often place hunting at the center of every day. Reality was probably less cinematic. A hunt can fail, an animal can disappear, weather can interfere, people can become injured, even success creates another problem. A large carcass must be processed and transported or consumed before scavengers and decay claim too much of it. Gathered foods can therefore provide essential stability alongside hunting. The relative importance of different foods remains difficult to calculate for many ancient populations. Archaeologists can identify butchered animal bones at some sites, yet plant foods frequently leave fainter traces. So when you picture today's meal, it is wiser to imagine variety rather than an endless prehistoric barbecue. You keep walking, eventually, someone notices something overhead. Bees. Their movement draws attention toward a tree. Honey is among the most energy-rich wild foods available to humans, and modern hunter-gatherer groups in several regions devote considerable effort to obtaining it. How far back specialized honey collecting extends cannot be demonstrated neatly. But humans and their ancestors almost certainly encountered wild honey long before written history. The idea seems delightful until you remember the bees. There is always paperwork, even in prehistory. Smoke can help reduce the enthusiasm of defensive insects, and experienced collectors can learn to locate nests by watching bee movements. In parts of Africa today, an extraordinary relationship exists between humans and greater honey-guide birds. These birds can lead people toward bee colonies, after which humans open the nest and the birds gain access to wax and other remains. Researchers have documented this cooperation among some African communities, and its antiquity is unknown. Perhaps something similar has deep roots. Perhaps it developed much later. The past remains politely silent. Still, it's a wonderful reminder that human food gathering can involve relationships with other species in surprisingly sophisticated ways. By midday, you rest beneath shade. Food collected during the morning is examined and divided. Some items can be eaten immediately, others need processing. Certain plant foods become easier to digest after pounding, soaking, roasting, or heating. Fire, which seemed mainly like warmth during your first night, begins revealing another role. Cooking changes food. It can soften tough tissues, improve digestibility, destroy some pathogens, and make certain nutrients easier to obtain. Humans had controlled fire long before 80,000 years ago, although archaeologists continue working to understand how consistently different populations used it across earlier periods. Back at camp, smoke rises again. Tubers may be placed near heat. Meat, if available, can be roasted. Shellfish in coastal regions can be heated. Seeds or nuts can be cracked, ground, or processed. You sit nearby as hands perform familiar routines. Nobody measures ingredients. Nobody consults a recipe. Experience provides the instructions. A stone strikes another object with a dull rhythm. Crack, pause, crack. A child reaches towards something and is gently redirected. Smoke drifts sideways. Your stomach responds enthusiastically when food is finally shared. You understand why the day's work cannot be reduced to hunting. The meal in front of you represents dozens of small decisions: where to walk, what to collect, what to ignore, when to dig, which tracks to follow, how long to search, when to return, what requires cooking, what can be shared immediately. There is no single heroic moment. That may be the most historically important part. Most prehistoric survival is ordinary. It is repetition, observation, patience. The same useful actions performed again and again across thousands of generations. Evening settles over the camp. You eat slowly beside the others. The fire warms your hands. Your feet ache pleasantly from walking. somewhere beyond the light, tomorrow's food is already growing, moving, hiding, ripening, or sleeping, and as darkness gathers, your attention returns to the flames themselves, because tomorrow you will discover that this small glowing circle does far more than cook dinner. The flames seem brighter once darkness has completely covered the landscape. You sit close enough to feel heat against your knees. A branch settles deeper into the fire with a soft crack. Sparks rise, glow for a moment, then disappear among the stars. Smoke moves lazily above the camp before the night breeze carries it away. Yesterday, fire helped transform the food gathered during the day. Tonight, you begin noticing everything else it does. Around 80,000 years ago, fire is already an ancient part of human life. Evidence for controlled fire stretches far deeper into the past. Although individual archaeological sites are not always easy to interpret, by the period you are visiting, Homo sapiens certainly belongs to a lineage with a long relationship with flame. Still, knowing how to use fire does not make it effortless. There are no matches in anyone's pocket, no lighter, no convenient switch. Keeping existing embers alive may sometimes be easier than creating a new fire, especially when suitable dry materials are difficult to find. You watch someone adjust the fuel, not too much, not too little. The arrangement allows air to move between the pieces. The person doing this has probably performed the task thousands of times. To you, it looks almost casual. That is what expertise often looks like. A few small movements hiding years of practice. The temperature continues falling. You move closer. Immediately, the practical value becomes obvious. Humans are unusual primates in many ways, and our relatively hairless bodies offer limited insulation against cold conditions. Clothing and shelter can help, but fire expands the range of temperatures in which people can remain comfortable. This becomes increasingly important as human populations eventually move into colder environments. For tonight, the warmth simply feels good. Your hands relax. The muscles around your shoulders loosen. Someone nearby extends their feet toward the heat. A child has already fallen asleep. Fire creates warmth, but it also changes the shape of the day without artificial light. Sunset could easily bring most activity to an end. Flames resist that darkness, not completely. The camp beyond the hearth remains dim. Faces appear and disappear as the fire shifts. Hands become silhouettes. Objects lying a few steps away are difficult to distinguish. Yet the immediate circle remains usable. Food can still be processed, tools can be examined, materials can be repaired, people can sit together. Night has become social time. That possibility has fascinated researchers studying human behavior around fires. Ethnographic observations of some modern hunter-gatherer communities have found that conversations after dark can differ from daytime talk, sometimes becoming more focused on stories, social relationships, distant people, traditions, and imagined events. You cannot simply project those patterns unchanged back 80,000 years. Cultures change, circumstances differ, but firelit evenings create something important that would have been available to ancient people too. Time together after work. You listen to the voices. During the day, communication often seemed practical. Movement, food, children, tools, directions. Now the rhythm feels different. One person speaks for longer, others listen. Someone responds. A few people make sounds that might be laughter. Perhaps you are witnessing a story, perhaps gossip, perhaps an explanation of tomorrow's plans. Perhaps someone is describing the prehistoric equivalent of a neighbor who borrowed something and still has not returned it. Human social life has probably never been entirely dignified. The archaeological record cannot tell you tonight's subject, but you can see what the fire makes possible. Everyone can look toward the speaker. Everyone can remain relatively comfortable. Children can listen while resting. Knowledge can move through the group without anyone walking anywhere. Imagine how useful that becomes. A person can describe a water source that younger members have never visited. Someone can recount an encounter with another group. A dangerous animal can be discussed without currently being present, which is generally the preferable arrangement. Events from the past can become lessons for the future. This is where memory stops belonging only to individuals. It can become shared. You stare into the flames. There is something strangely familiar about doing that. Even today, people who rarely encounter open fire often find themselves watching one almost automatically. A fireplace can turn a room full of sophisticated adults into people happily staring at burning wood for an hour. Your companions would probably understand. The flames also provide another practical benefit: protection. Fire can discourage some predators. Although it is not an invisible wall, animals behave differently depending on species, hunger, experience, and circumstance. Smoke and human activity may make the camp less attractive to certain visitors. Someone still pays attention to the darkness. You notice that now, while others relax. One person occasionally looks beyond the light. Fire improves security. It does not eliminate the need for awareness. The wind changes. Smoke reaches you. Your eyes water immediately. You shift position. The smoke follows. Naturally, humanity may eventually build cities, cross oceans, split atoms, and send machines beyond the solar system. But nobody will ever reliably choose the one place around a campfire where smoke has promised not to go. A few people rearrange themselves. The fire crackles innocently. Another piece of wood is added. Fuel itself requires work. Every branch burning tonight had to be collected. In wooded environments that might seem easy, but repeated occupation can reduce convenient fuel near camp. Wet conditions create additional problems. In more open or arid landscapes, wood may be scattered. Other combustible materials can sometimes supplement it. The location of a camp therefore involves more than choosing a pleasant view. Water matters, food matters, shelter matters, raw materials matter, fuel matters. Human comfort is built from geography. You notice something else beside the fire. A stone has been placed near the heat. Heating materials can sometimes be intentional. Much later archaeological evidence clearly shows heated stones used in cooking and other activities. While controlled heat treatment was also used in southern Africa to improve certain stone materials for tool making by at least tens of thousands of years ago. Some evidence for deliberate heat treatment reaches surprisingly far back into the Middle Stone Age. That is a wonderful little complication. Fire is not merely something humans sit beside. Eventually, people learn to manipulate heat as part of technology itself. The boundary between nature and tool begins becoming less obvious. Wood becomes flame. Flame changes food. Heat alters stone. Smoke affects animals. Light changes social behavior. One controlled process creates several new possibilities. Questions remain about when different fire-related techniques became routine. Burned material can be difficult to interpret because natural fires also leave traces, and ancient hearths can be disturbed over enormous spans of time. So archaeologists often work carefully, comparing ash, charcoal, burned bone, sediment, and spatial patterns before deciding what happened. You have the unfair advantage of sitting here while it happens. The fire begins shrinking, conversation slows. Someone pushes glowing material together, preserving a concentrated bed of embers. The orange light becomes softer. Faces retreat gradually into shadow. You lie back on your bedding. Warmth reaches one side of you. Cool night air touches the other. The smell of smoke has settled into your hair, your covering, your skin, nearby. Breathing becomes slow and regular. You think about the generations before this night. Someone once learned that food changed near flame. Someone learned which wood burned well. Someone learned how to carry embers. Someone discovered that heat could alter useful materials. Nobody needed to understand combustion scientifically. They needed to remember what worked. That knowledge passed from person to person until fire became something more than a natural event. It became part of human life. The final visible flame folds into the embers. Tomorrow morning, in better light, you will sit beside the people whose hands keep this world functioning and watch stone, wood, bone, and fibre become tools. For now, the fire remains awake while almost everyone else drifts toward a sleep. By morning, the fire has become a shallow bed of grey ash with a few stubborn points of red still glowing underneath. Someone crouches beside it and gently moves the remains together. A little dry material is added. There is a careful breath. Smoke rises. Then a tiny flame appears. You watch for a moment before another sound draws your attention. Tap, pause, tap. A short distance away. Someone is sitting on the ground with a piece of stone held carefully between the hands. Another stone strikes it. A thin fragment breaks away. The sound is sharp but strangely soothing. Tap, pause, tap. You move closer. For people living around 80,000 years ago, stone tools are already part of an immensely old technological tradition. Human ancestors had been making deliberately shaped stone implements for millions of years by your period. Communities across Africa were using technologies archaeologists generally associate with the Middle Stone Age. The tools could include points, flakes, scrapers, cutting edges, and other forms designed for particular jobs. What you're watching is not the invention of tools, it is the inheritance of an ancient craft. The person turns the stone. Another strike follows. A flake separates. You pick up one of the discarded fragments. Its edge is unexpectedly sharp. Very sharp. You immediately become more respectful. Stone tools can produce cutting edges capable of slicing hide, meat, plant material, and other substances. Some flakes require surprisingly little modification because the fracture itself creates a useful edge. The challenge is producing that fracture deliberately. You try to imagine doing it. Find the right stone. Choose the correct angle. Control the force. Understand where the material is likely to break. Avoid destroying the useful piece. Preferably keep all your fingers. Suddenly the task seems less simple. Experimental archaeologists who reproduce ancient stone technology often spend years developing their skill. A skilled napper can anticipate how force will travel through stone in ways that are almost invisible to an inexperienced observer. The person beside you sees possibilities inside the rock. You see a rock. This is becoming a recurring theme. Not every stone works equally well. Different regions provide materials such as flint, chert, quartz, quartzite, silcrete, obsidian, and other workable rocks. People sometimes traveled significant distances to obtain desirable material, or acquired it through contact with neighboring groups. That means the tool in front of you begins before anyone strikes it. First, someone must know where suitable stone exists. Yesterday's invisible map returns. A source might lie near water. Another might be exposed on a hillside. A particularly useful material might come from much farther away. Archaeologists can sometimes identify the geological origin of stone artifacts, allowing them to reconstruct ancient movement and exchange. A small point can quietly reveal a surprisingly large social world. The toolmaker strikes again. Nearby, a younger person watches. There is no written manual, no diagram, no slow-motion instructional video with cheerful background music. Knowledge must move directly between human beings. Perhaps the learner observes, Perhaps the experienced maker demonstrates. Perhaps mistakes are corrected. How formal such teaching was is difficult to establish. Some researchers argue that complex stone technologies would have benefited greatly from active instruction. Others point out that observation, imitation, repeated practice, and participation can transmit substantial technical knowledge without anything resembling a classroom. You watch the younger person attempt to strike. The result is unimpressive. Nobody appears shocked. Another attempt follows. This is how expertise begins, not with perfection, with repetition. The finished stone point is only one component of a larger technology. A sharp point can become far more useful when attached to a wooden shaft. That requires another set of skills. Wood must be selected. The shaft may need shaping or straightening. The stone must be positioned securely. Bindings can be made from sinew, plant fibers, or other materials. Adhesives may also be involved. And here you encounter one of the more surprising details of prehistoric technology. Ancient humans could make compound glues. Evidence from Middle Stone Age Africa shows that people produced adhesives using substances such as plant gums and ochre. Creating a reliable adhesive can require controlled preparation and an understanding of how ingredients behave. It is not chemistry written in equations, but it is practical chemistry. Someone learned that combining materials produced a useful result. Someone remembered the proportions or preparation. Someone showed someone else. Generations kept the technique alive. The finished object is therefore not simply a sharpened rock. It is a compound tool: stone, wood, binding, adhesive. Several materials with different properties joined into one useful system. You turn the idea over in your mind. Modern technology often feels completely different because it contains metals, plastics, electronics, and software. Yet the underlying habit is familiar. Take materials that do different things, combine them, create something none could accomplish alone. Human engineering begins quietly. Another person nearby is working with wood. Wooden artifacts rarely survive from such deep periods because organic materials decay, which creates another misleading picture of prehistoric technology. Museums are filled with stone partly because stone is extraordinarily patient. Wood is less cooperative. A wooden spear left for tens of thousands of years usually disappears unless preservation conditions are exceptional. So the archaeological record may show only a fraction of what people actually carried. Wooden digging sticks could help uncover roots. Shafts could extend the reach of stone points. Branches could become shelter frames. Containers might be produced from plant materials, bark, skin, or other substances. Cordage opens even more possibilities. Twisted plant fibers can become string. String can become bindings. Bindings can secure tools. More elaborate fiber technologies can eventually create nets, bags, traps, and clothing. Direct evidence for ancient fibers is scarce because they decay so easily. Their absence from many sites does not mean ancient hands ignored them. You notice those hands now. They are rarely still. One person sharpens, another scrapes. Someone twists material between fingers. A tool is inspected, adjusted, then inspected again. Maintenance matters because replacing equipment requires time and resources. A damaged edge may be resharpened. A point may be replaced. A shaft can perhaps be repaired. Nothing is casually thrown away if it remains useful. There is something calming about the rhythm. Scrape, turn, check, tap, pause, tap. The camp sounds almost like a workshop, except there are no walls, and no manager asking whether everyone has completed the quarterly tool production report. A small flake falls into the dust. You remember that archaeologists tens of thousands of years later may become excited about exactly this sort of discarded object. Waste can reveal how tools were made. Clusters of flakes can indicate working areas. Microscopic wear can suggest what edges were used to cut. Residues may preserve traces of plants, blood, adhesive, or pigment. Even the rubbish has a story. Interpretation is rarely straightforward, though a stone shape does not always reveal one precise function. The same tool may have served several purposes, and different communities could use similar forms differently. Specialists therefore compare experimental replicas, where patterns, residues, context, and many other clues. The deeper you travel into prehistory, the more comfortable you become with uncertainty. There are things you can know, things you can reasonably infer, and things that remain just beyond reach. The people around you do not have that problem. They know exactly why today's tools are being prepared. A point may be needed tomorrow. A cutting edge may process food tonight. A digging tool may help someone gather plants. Every object belongs to a chain of daily activity. As afternoon fades, the toolmaker places the finished piece aside. The younger learner picks up another stone. Tap. The first strike goes badly. The second is better. You smile. Nobody here writes down the lesson, yet the lesson survives. Hand to hand, eye to eye, generation to generation. And as the evening air cools, you begin noticing the hides, grasses, fibers, and coverings around camp more carefully. Because tools may shape the world around humans, but tonight the falling temperature will remind you of another challenge, keeping the human body warm. By late afternoon, the warmth of the sun has begun slipping away. You notice it first on your arms. A few hours earlier, shade felt pleasant. Now the same breeze moving through the camp carries enough coolness to make you instinctively draw your covering closer, around you. Nobody seems surprised. People are preparing for evening. The tools you watched being shaped earlier are put aside. Food is moved closer to the fire. Dry vegetation is gathered. A hide lying in the sunlight is lifted and brought toward the sleeping area. You run your fingers across its surface. It feels heavier than modern fabric, rough in places, soft in others, and immediately you're reminded of a simple problem every human population must solve. Your body loses heat. At 80,000 years ago, Homo sapiens already lives across environments that can vary enormously in temperature and rainfall. Africa is not one endless warm grassland. Mountains, high plateaus, deserts, forests, temperate coastal regions, and seasonal climates create very different conditions. Night itself can transform a comfortable landscape. Sunset arrives. Heat stored in the ground begins escaping. You understand why shelter matters. The camp you've been visiting does not contain permanent houses, but that does not mean people simply lie wherever darkness finds them. Mobile hunter-gatherers can choose camps strategically, taking advantage of rock shelters, caves, trees, wind protection, water access, fuel, and nearby food resources. Temporary structures can also be built. The difficulty for you, looking across 80,000 years, is that most of the materials disappear. Wood decays, grass decays, hide decays, fiber decays. Stone survives and consequently receives an unfair amount of attention. If someone builds a clever shelter from branches and grass, then abandons it, future archaeologists may find almost nothing recognizable. You watch several people arrange material near the sleeping area. Perhaps branches form a simple framework. Vegetation creates insulation. A hide may block wind. Nothing needs to resemble a modern house. The purpose is immediate. Reduce exposure. Stay dry when possible. Preserve warmth. Create somewhere safer to rest. You crouch near a layer of grass. This brings you to one of the quieter surprises of deep prehistory. At Border Cave in southern Africa, archaeologists have found evidence interpreted as plant bedding dating back roughly 200,000 years. Far earlier than the night you are experiencing, Ancient people appear to have deliberately arranged grasses for sleeping or living surfaces. Some layers included plants with insect-repelling properties. Think about that for a moment. Someone in the deep past may have preferred particular vegetation not simply because it was comfortable, but because insects found it unpleasant. Your prehistoric bed may have come with botanical pest control. No scented candle on the bedside table, admittedly, but the basic desire is wonderfully recognizable. You want somewhere reasonably comfortable to sleep, and you would prefer that small creatures not spend the night exploring your face. Smoke can help too. Ash from old fires may discourage crawling insects in certain circumstances. At some archaeological sites, repeated burning and replacement of bedding seems to have helped maintain living surfaces. You look down at the camp floor differently now. It is not just ground. It can be managed, cleaned, covered, rearranged, burned, renewed. Domestic life begins long before houses. The temperature falls another little step. You pull the hide around your shoulders. What people wore at this time is much harder to reconstruct. Animal skins were certainly available, and stone tools could scrape and process hides. Yet exactly how clothing was shaped, fastened, or routinely used 80,000 years ago remains largely invisible. Needles with eyes belong more clearly to later periods. That does not prevent earlier people from creating coverings. A hide does not require modern tailoring to keep wind away from skin. Plant fibers, sinew, strips of leather, and simple ties can secure materials in many ways. The surviving evidence leaves several possibilities open. Some specialists have tried to approach the question through human parasites. Yes, lice. History is generous like that. Body lice are adapted to living in clothing, unlike head lice. And genetic studies have attempted to estimate when clothing use became sufficiently regular for body lice to diverge. Different analyses have produced different dates, often much later than the period you're visiting, and the estimates carry considerable uncertainty. The method is fascinating precisely because the clothing itself is gone. When fabric refuses to survive, researchers occasionally ask the lice. You suspect nobody around the fire would appreciate knowing that this is how distant descendants may investigate their wardrobe. A child settles onto the bedding. Another person places a covering nearby. The scene makes you think about temperature in a different way. Warmth is not created by one invention. It is layered. Choose a protected location. Build or use shelter. Prepare bedding. Cover the body. Share enclosed space. Maintain fire. Keep dry. Move when necessary. Each method contributes a little. Together they create survivable nights. Your modern bedroom works similarly, although it hides the process behind insulation, heating systems, glass windows, manufactured blankets, and a thermostat that allows you to become irritated because the room is 1 degree warmer than preferred. Here, comfort requires more participation. Someone checks the wind. Another adjusts material along the exposed side of the sleeping area. You notice how carefully the camp responds to the landscape rather than attempting to dominate it. If a rock face blocks the prevailing wind, use it. If trees provide shade, settle near them when appropriate. If rain threatens a low area, avoid it. If insects gather near stagnant water, perhaps sleep farther away. Choosing a campsite is itself a technology. There is another reason shelter matters. Children. A small child loses body heat more quickly than a large adult. Rest also becomes important when people have spent the day walking, carrying, gathering, and working. Sleep is not wasted time. It restores bodies that must perform again tomorrow. Exactly how prehistoric people organize sleep is impossible to reconstruct with confidence. They may not have followed the uninterrupted 8-hour pattern often promoted today. Modern studies of non-industrial communities show that human sleep can vary with temperature, season, light, social activity, and cultural habit. People may wake during the night, someone may tend the fire, a child may stir, animals may make noise outside. Sleep has probably never been as tidy as the numbers on a health app suggest. Darkness deepens, you lie down. Dry grass compresses beneath your weight. A hide covers part of your body. The ground still feels firm, but the vegetation creates a thin insulating barrier nearby. Another person settles, then another. Body warmth accumulates. The fire gives occasional clicks. You hear someone breathing, farther away. Insects continue their steady nighttime rhythm. For a few moments, you look toward the opening of the shelter. Stars are visible beyond it. Cold air remains outside, but not entirely. A faint current reaches your face. You tuck the covering closer. Nothing about the arrangement is luxurious, yet luxury is relative. After spending an entire day exposed to sun, wind, dust, insects, and uneven ground, a protected sleeping place feels remarkably welcoming. You begin understanding another quiet truth about prehistoric survival. Humans do not merely adapt biologically to environments, they modify the immediate environment around their bodies. A sharpened stone extends the hand, a digging stick extends reach. Fire creates warmth where none existed. Bedding changes the ground. A covering changes the body's relationship with cold. Shelter changes the wind. Small inventions accumulate until a vulnerable primate can live in places its naked body alone would struggle to tolerate. That ability will eventually become crucial. Far in the future of this camp, human populations will move through deserts, across coastlines, into highlands, and ultimately toward freezing ice age environments far beyond Africa. They will not wait for evolution to grow thick fur. They will carry solutions with them. For now, though, you remain under a simple covering as the fire sinks lower. Your fingers are warm, your breathing slows, and near the edge of the sleeping area, you notice a faint patch of red pigment on a hide and another trace on someone's skin. Tomorrow, those colours will lead you towards something more difficult to explain than warmth or hunger. They will lead you toward the hidden world of the human mind. The red mark is still visible when morning light reaches the camp. At first, you barely notice it. There are more immediate things happening around you. Someone is reviving the fire. A child is searching through the bedding. Food from yesterday is being inspected. Birds have begun their morning calls from somewhere beyond the trees. Then sunlight touches the hide beside you. A patch of colour appears, deep red, not bright like modern paint, but rich enough to stand apart from the browns, greys, and dusty greens surrounding it. You sit up and look more closely. The colour may come from ochre, a naturally occurring mineral material rich in iron compounds. Humans were collecting and using ochre in Africa long before 80,000 years ago. That alone is interesting, but what people did with it becomes more intriguing. Ochre can have practical purposes. It may help in preparing adhesives. It can be used on hides. In some circumstances, it may offer protection against sunlight or insects. But pieces of ochre also appear in context suggesting that colour itself mattered, and suddenly the people around you become harder to understand. Yesterday, their objects had obvious purposes. A sharp edge cuts. A hide keeps you warm. A fire cooks food. A digging stick reaches underground. Red pigment is less cooperative. You can ask what it does. The more interesting question is what it means. Nearby, someone holds a piece of mineral and works its surface against stone. Fine reddish powder collects below. Perhaps it will be mixed with another substance. Perhaps it will colour skin. Perhaps it has a completely practical purpose that would disappoint every archaeologist hoping for symbolism. You simply do not know. That uncertainty becomes especially fascinating because of discoveries from southern Africa. At Blombos Cave, archaeologists have uncovered engraved pieces of ochre dating to roughly the broad period surrounding your journey, including examples with deliberately made geometric patterns. Lines cross other lines, shapes repeat. The markings do not appear to result simply from using the ochre as a tool. Someone intentionally created a pattern. You imagine holding such a piece. It would fit comfortably in your hand, small enough to lose, small enough that most people today might walk past it without realizing they had just ignored one of the most intriguing objects from early human history. There is no explanation scratched beside the design, no message saying what the lines represent. They could mark identity, they could relate to memory, they could be decoration, they could carry social meaning. They might represent something researchers have not imagined. Several interpretations remain possible because symbols only work when people understand the system around them. If you found a modern wedding ring without knowing anything about modern culture, you could measure its diameter perfectly and still miss most of its significance. Meaning is difficult to excavate. You look around the camp, perhaps meaning is everywhere. A particular hairstyle might indicate something. A scar could carry a history. A colour might identify membership. A necklace might show connection. The way someone prepares an object could follow a tradition older than anyone alive. Most of those signals would disappear archaeologically. This is one reason the surviving fragments matter so much. Later in the morning, you notice another object, a shell. It is small. There appears to be an opening through it. Perforated shells from African Middle Stone Age sites have been interpreted as beads. With examples known from locations including Blombos Cave and sites in North Africa, some date back more than 70,000 years, and others are older still. Several show wear consistent with being suspended or strung. That changes the atmosphere of the camp. A shell collected for food is one thing. A shell carried because of its appearance, modified, pierced, coloured, or worn is another. You imagine a cord around someone's neck. Several shells move gently against the skin as the person walks. They make a faint clicking sound. Why wear them today? The answer seems obvious because your own world is saturated with decoration. Rings, watches, earrings, tattoos, logos, uniforms, hairstyles. Even choosing not to decorate yourself can communicate something. Humans constantly turn bodies into social displays. Perhaps people here are already doing something similar. The interesting part is that beads can travel. A shell originates somewhere. If it appears far inland, someone carried it. Perhaps the wearer visited the coast. Perhaps another person gave it to them. Perhaps it moved through several exchanges. An ornament can therefore contain both meaning and geography. A tiny object may quietly say, I belong, I remember, I have connections, or I came from somewhere else. Of course, you cannot confidently translate it. The archaeological evidence gives you behaviour, not vocabulary. Some researchers see the widespread appearance of beads, engraved objects, pigments, and increasingly complex technologies as evidence that symbolic culture became especially visible during this broad span of prehistory. Others caution against imagining a sudden mental revolution. The human brain had been evolving for a very long time, and symbolic behavior may have developed unevenly, appearing differently across regions and leaving traces only when materials happened to survive. Perhaps there was no single morning when humanity woke up symbolic. Perhaps the change was gradual, a gesture here, a colour there, an object preserved for reasons beyond immediate usefulness, a tradition repeated, a pattern understood by several people, then by their children. Culture can accumulate quietly. You spend part of the afternoon watching someone prepare pigment. Stone grinds against stone. The sound is soft and repetitive. Red dust gathers. Hands become stained. That detail makes the distant past suddenly intimate. Imagine washing ochre from your fingers 80,000 years ago. Imagine complaining because it refuses to come out from beneath your nails. Some inconveniences deserve to survive through the ages. Nearby, children are playing. One picks up an object, another reaches for it. There is a brief disagreement. An adult intervenes. Nothing about the scene feels abstract. Yet behind these ordinary actions lies an extraordinary ability. Humans can assign meaning to things that do not naturally contain it. A shell becomes more than shell. A line becomes more than scratch. A colour becomes more than mineral. Once a group agrees that something represents something else, an invisible world appears alongside the physical one. Identity, status, memory, belonging, obligation, tradition, perhaps spiritual ideas too. Although evidence for specific beliefs at this age is exceptionally difficult to interpret, burial practices from parts of the Middle Paleolithic have sometimes been used to explore ancient attitudes toward death. But even apparently deliberate burials do not automatically reveal what people believed. You resist the temptation to invent a religion for the people beside you. They have already endured enough speculation. Instead, you focus on what you can see. One person gives an object to another. The receiver keeps it. That exchange could mean almost nothing. Or it could mean everything. Without shared language and cultural knowledge, you remain outside the invisible system connecting these people. Even after days among them, you understand their tools better than their minds. Evening comes. The pigment looks darker in firelight. A shell bead catches a small flash of orange. Someone speaks, others listen. You remember the possibility of stories around last night's fire. Now you wonder whether those stories explain the objects you saw today. Perhaps a pattern has a name. Perhaps a colour recalls a place. Perhaps an ornament belonged to someone else before its current wearer. Meaning can travel across generations just as tool-making skills do, but meaning needs communication. Complex ideas cannot easily survive if every generation must rediscover them from silence. As voices continue around the fire, you begin paying closer attention to their rhythm. Tomorrow, you will enter the most invisible part of this ancient world. Not stone, not pigment, not bone. The vanished sound of human language. The voices continue long after the last red light has disappeared from the western sky. Tonight, you listen differently until now. Speech has mostly blended into the background of camp life. You heard people calling to one another, comforting children, coordinating movement, and speaking beside the fire. Now you concentrate on the sounds themselves. A voice rises slightly, another answers. Someone speaks in a longer sequence, pauses, then receives a response from several listeners. There is rhythm here, timing, turn-taking, repetition, perhaps humour. You still understand absolutely nothing. This places you in the unusual position of hearing what may be a perfectly ordinary conversation while possessing roughly the comprehension of a confused rock. The people around you, however, understand. That matters enormously. Language does not fossilize. A stone point can survive beneath sediment for tens of thousands of years. A tooth can mineralize. Ochre can preserve deliberate scratches. A spoken sentence disappears almost immediately. So when you ask what human language sounded like 80,000 years ago, archaeology offers no recording. There is no ancient voice waiting to be played. Yet language may be one of the most important technologies in this entire camp. You notice its usefulness when morning comes. Several people are preparing to leave. One speaks while pointing toward distant country. Another responds without moving. Perhaps they are discussing water, perhaps animals, perhaps another group. Whatever the subject, information about something beyond the immediate camp can apparently influence decisions here. That is powerful. An animal can communicate danger when danger appears. Humans can potentially discuss danger that appeared yesterday, or somewhere else, or might appear tomorrow. Language allows experience to escape the moment in which it happened. You follow several people away from camp. A child comes too, along the path. An adult points toward vegetation and speaks. The child looks. Yesterday you watched knowledge being transmitted through imitation. Language adds another layer. Instead of merely demonstrating which plant to collect, a speaker can potentially explain where it grows, when it appears, which part is useful, and what happens if you choose the wrong one. The lesson becomes portable. Complex technology benefits in the same way. Think back to the stoneworker. You could learn by watching where the hammerstone strikes, but words could direct attention toward details that are difficult to see. Angle, force, material, sequence. A learner does not have to discover every mistake personally. This is cultural accumulation. One generation can inherit solutions created by earlier generations and then modify them. The exact linguistic abilities of ancient humans remain one of the hardest questions in human evolution. Researchers approach it indirectly through anatomy, genetics, archaeology, cognition, and comparisons with other primates. None provides a complete answer. The vocal tract contains soft tissues that rarely survive. Brain organization cannot be reconstructed simply by measuring a skull. Genes associated with speech and language usually perform multiple biological functions. So discovering a genetic variant does not give you an ancient dictionary. Even the famous FOXP2 gene, sometimes casually described as a language gene, is much more complicated than that label suggests. It contributes to neural processes involved in speech and motor learning. But language cannot be reduced to one genetic switch. Neanderthals also possessed derived versions of FOXP2 associated with modern humans. So the evolutionary story clearly extends beyond your own species sitting beside this path. You keep listening. Someone says something short. The others change direction. Efficient, whatever grammar exists here. It has successfully prevented an unnecessary meeting. Modern office workers can only dream. Later, you return toward camp and hear laughter before you see anyone. At least, you think it is laughter. Human laughter has evolutionary roots deeper than Homo sapiens. Other great apes produce laughter like vocalizations during play, suggesting that some foundations of this behavior existed in distant common ancestors. But human humor can depend heavily on language. A joke can refer to absent people, shared memories, expectations, embarrassment, or wordplay. Did people tell jokes 80,000 years ago? There is no artifact that can answer. Still, if sophisticated language existed, it is difficult to imagine humans restricting it entirely to serious subjects. Someone must eventually have made fun of someone else's terrible attempt at tool-making. Possibly yours. You sit near several adults working with plant material. Conversation continues while hands move. This combination feels familiar. People can work and speak simultaneously. Information circulates without requiring a special ceremony. News, instructions, relationships, plans, perhaps stories about people no longer alive. This last possibility changes how you think about history before writing. Memory depends on living minds and repeated communication. A person dies. Their experiences do not necessarily disappear with them. Some can survive as stories. A remembered drought can become advice. A successful journey can become a route. An encounter with another group can become a warning. A skilled person's technique can become tradition. Words allow the dead to influence people they will never meet. You cannot know how far back particular oral traditions extend in this camp, but once language becomes sufficiently expressive, the possibility exists. As afternoon cools, children gather near an older adult. Perhaps there is teaching, perhaps storytelling, Perhaps the children are simply being told to stop doing whatever children 80,000 years ago have discovered they should not be doing. You listen to repeated sounds. Could these people have names? Almost certainly some form of individual reference would be extremely useful in a social group. But the names themselves are gone. This is one of the saddest little disappearances of prehistory. Millions upon millions of people lived before writing. They were recognized, called, remembered, loved, annoying, funny, skilled, stubborn. Their companions knew exactly who they were. You know almost none of their names, not because their lives lacked importance, because sound leaves no sediment. The languages themselves vanish too. Modern human languages are extraordinarily diverse, but linguistic reconstruction can only reach so far into the past. Languages change constantly, sounds shift, words are replaced, grammars transform. Over thousands of years, relationships become difficult to demonstrate across tens of thousands. Most direct linguistic ancestry disappears beyond reliable reconstruction. The language you hear tonight may have no surviving descendant that anyone could identify. You look around the fire after sunset. Someone begins speaking at length. The others become quiet. You cannot determine whether this is practical instruction, personal memory, entertainment, or something connected to the red pigment and shell ornaments you saw yesterday. That mystery is almost comforting. You do not need to translate every moment. You can simply watch faces responding to a voice. A child leans against an adult. Someone pokes the fire. Another person smiles. The speaker continues. Language is happening, and with it comes an invisible architecture more complex than any shelter in camp. Relationships can be named. Promises can be made. Places can be described. Events can be remembered. Possibilities can be imagined. Perhaps things that do not physically exist can be discussed together. That ability will eventually help humans create laws, myths, trade agreements, kingdoms, calendars, mathematics, and bedtime history channels asking you to relax thousands of generations later. But none of that exists tonight. Only voices. Then, somewhere beyond the camp, another sound appears. Not an animal, a distant human call. Several people turn their heads. You follow their gaze toward the darkness. For the first time, you remember that this small band is not humanity. Other groups live beyond the familiar landscape and much farther away. Other kinds of humans are living too. Tomorrow, your world becomes more crowded. The distant call comes again. This time, someone beside you answers. The response travels into the darkness, and then the camp becomes quiet. Nobody appears frightened. A few people remain attentive, but there is none of the sudden alarm you might expect if strangers were approaching. Perhaps the voice belongs to someone known. Perhaps another band is nearby. You're beginning to understand that the people around this fire do not live inside an isolated bubble. Families move, individuals meet, groups separate and reunite, objects travel, knowledge travels with them, and somewhere far beyond this familiar landscape, another remarkable fact complicates the human story. Homo sapiens is not the only kind of human alive. Around 80,000 years ago, several human populations inhabit different parts of Africa and Eurasia. Their relationships are difficult to compress into neat categories, because evolution rarely provides the clean branches that diagrams prefer. To the north and west across Eurasia live Neanderthals. Farther east are populations connected with the mysterious Denisovans. Other groups may also exist whose identities remain poorly understood. You will never see most of them from this camp. But eventually your descendants will... Morning arrives. The visitors from last night become visible near the edge of camp. They look entirely human to you. That observation sounds obvious, but it is worth remembering. Different bands of Homo sapiens probably varied in appearance, language, customs, ornaments, and technology. Yet all belong to populations within the wider African history of your species. Objects may move between such groups. Partners may move too. Information can spread far beyond the distance one person travels during an ordinary day. You notice a piece of stone carried by one visitor. Its material looks different from what you saw being worked earlier. Perhaps it came from another region. Perhaps not. But archaeological sites sometimes contain stone transported over considerable distances, providing glimpses of ancient mobility and exchange. Your small camp may therefore belong to a social landscape extending far beyond what you can see. Now imagine following those connections northward across many generations. Eventually the world changes. Africa gives way to northeastern corridors leading toward the Levant and Arabia. Beyond them lies Eurasia. And there you could encounter a human whose body is built somewhat differently from yours. A Neanderthal. Popular culture has not always treated Neanderthals kindly. For much of modern history they were portrayed as lumbering, dim creatures, almost as though evolution had produced an unfortunate relative nobody wanted to mention at dinner. The archaeological picture is far richer. Neanderthals had large brains, sophisticated stone technologies, controlled fire, hunted large animals, occupied challenging climates, and cared for individuals who survived serious injuries. Some sites also contain pigments, ornaments, modified objects, and other evidence that has prompted increasingly complex discussions about Neanderthal symbolic behavior. If one stood across a valley from you, you would not be looking at an ape awkwardly pretending to be human. You would be looking at another human lineage. Their bodies tend to be stockier than those of many early Homo sapiens. Broad trunks and relatively shorter limbs are useful characteristics in cold environments because they reduce surface area relative to body mass. Their faces also have distinctive anatomical features, including prominent brow regions and large nasal openings. But appearance is only the beginning. Neanderthals had been living across Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They knew those landscapes. They survived winters your current companions have never experienced. They made tools adapted to local needs. They raised children. They probably communicated in complex ways, although exactly what their language capacities were cannot be recovered directly. Then there are the Denisovans. They're even more elusive. You might expect an entire ancient human population to have left behind a convenient collection of skeletons. The Denisovans declined to cooperate. Their modern discovery began with remarkably small fossil remains from Denisova Cave in Siberia, including a finger bone fragment and teeth. Ancient DNA revealed that these remains represented a population genetically distinct from both modern humans and Neanderthals. Genetics had identified a human group that archaeology had barely seen. That is one of the stranger turns in the study of prehistory. A tiny piece of finger transformed the human family tree. Since then, additional evidence has expanded the Denisovan story, including remains linked genetically or through proteins to Denisovan-related populations. Yet their full geographic range, physical appearance, and cultural diversity remain difficult to reconstruct. Their genetic legacy provides another clue. Some people alive today carry Denisovan ancestry, particularly populations in Oceania and parts of Asia. One Denisovan-derived genetic variant, associated with adaptation to high altitude, occurs at high frequency among Tibetans, so a population that disappeared as a distinct group continues helping some modern humans live where oxygen is thin. The past can remain inside the body long after names disappear. Neanderthals left a genetic inheritance too. Most people with ancestry outside sub-Saharan Africa carry a small percentage of Neanderthal-derived DNA. The result of ancient interbreeding between populations. This means encounters between different human groups were not always encounters across an absolute biological boundary. They sometimes had children together. The older picture of one species simply replacing another has therefore become much messier and much more interesting. You sit beside the morning fire thinking about that future. The people around you cannot know that some descendants of African Homo sapiens will eventually meet Neanderthals. Those meetings will probably not constitute one dramatic event. Different populations may encounter one another repeatedly. They might avoid each other, compete, exchange information, share territory at different times, form relationships. The surviving record supports contact and interbreeding, but it cannot reconstruct the emotional texture of individual meetings. Were some encounters peaceful? Almost certainly. Were others tense? Probably. Did people recognize one another as fundamentally similar? There is no archaeological instrument capable of measuring first impressions. You can only imagine two groups noticing differences in faces, clothing, voices, tools, and behavior. Perhaps curiosity came first. Perhaps caution, likely both, even within Africa. The story's becoming more complicated than scientists once assumed. Genetic research suggests that Homo sapiens did not necessarily arise from one tiny, isolated population living in one location. Instead, populations across Africa may have remained partly separated while occasionally exchanging genes and cultural innovations over long periods. The origins of modern humanity may resemble a network more than a single birthplace. Several models are still being tested because ancient African DNA is difficult to recover in warm climates, and fossils provide incomplete snapshots. You look at the visitors again. Networks. That word keeps returning. Yesterday it described language. Before that, food sharing. Now it describes humanity itself. Groups connect, separate, reconnect, genes move, tools move, ideas move. Sometimes populations remain apart long enough to become distinct. Sometimes they meet again. By evening, the visitors are sitting near the fire. Food passes between hands. Voices overlap. A child from one group watches someone from the other working with stone. Perhaps tomorrow the child will imitate what they saw. That is how a technique can cross a social boundary without anyone recording the event. Far beyond the horizon, Neanderthals are tending their own fires. Denisovan-related groups are living beneath other skies. Unknown populations may occupy landscapes whose evidence has barely survived. Humanity is not one straight line marching toward you. It is a braided river. Channels divide. Some vanish. Others meet again. And soon one branch of Homo sapiens will begin moving farther beyond Africa, carrying African ancestry, technologies, memories, and social habits into landscapes occupied by other humans tomorrow. You will follow those quiet footsteps north and east. The visitors leave shortly after sunrise. You watch them disappear between patches of vegetation, carrying tools, food, knowledge, and perhaps messages toward people you will never meet. Their departure feels ordinary. That is precisely what makes it useful. Human movement does not always look like migration while it is happening. Nobody wakes one morning and announces that their descendants are about to alter the geographic history of the species. Usually, people simply move towards something: water, food, relatives, safer ground, a familiar seasonal camp, a coastline, a river valley. Then another generation moves again, around 80,000 years ago. Homo sapiens is still primarily an African species, but humans have already crossed beyond Africa before this period. Fossils from the Levant show that early modern humans reached southwestern Asia during earlier episodes, well over 100,000 years ago. Those early movements did not necessarily produce the main ancestry of later populations living across Eurasia. Some appear to have been expansions that eventually faded or were absorbed. Human migration is rarely a single procession, it pulses. You leave camp in your imagination and follow one of those pulses northward. The journey immediately becomes less tidy than the arrows printed in modern textbooks. A map might show a line leaving Africa. Real people encounter mountains, deserts, rivers, disease, unfamiliar plants, competing groups, changing coastlines, and children who become tired long before the arrow reaches its destination. Movement happens at walking speed. More importantly, it happens at generational speed. You may travel only a modest distance during your own lifetime. Your children know territory slightly farther away. Their children extend the familiar world again. After centuries, a population can occupy landscapes that no founding traveller ever imagined. There are several possible gateways out of Africa. One leads through northeastern Africa toward the Sinai Peninsula and the Levant. Another possibility involves crossing the southern Red Sea region between the Horn of Africa and Arabia, particularly during periods when sea levels were lower and environmental conditions favourable. Neither route needs to have been used only once. The evidence does not require one grand departure. Different groups may have moved through different corridors at different times. You picture yourself approaching the Red Sea. The air smells of salt. Bare ground warms beneath your feet. Across the water lies Arabia. Today, the distance can look like a natural border between continents. During the Pleistocene, however, sea levels repeatedly fell as water became locked in enormous ice sheets elsewhere on Earth. Lower sea levels narrowed some crossings and exposed coastal landscapes now submerged. Even so, water remained a serious obstacle in many places. Did humans intentionally cross stretches of open water this early? Possibly in some regions. Exactly what technologies they used are almost completely lost because wood, reeds, fibre, and other potential boat-building materials preserve poorly. A raft can change human history and leave almost nothing behind. That is one of archaeology's recurring frustrations. The more organic the invention, the more likely time is to eat the evidence. You continue eastward in imagination. Arabia today evokes immense deserts, but the Arabian Peninsula has not always looked as dry as it does now. During wetter climatic phases, lakes, grasslands, and river systems appeared across areas that are currently arid. Stone tools and other archaeological discoveries show that ancient humans repeatedly entered Arabia when conditions allowed. The desert could become green, then dry again, then green again thousands of years later. Your migration route can therefore appear and disappear without moving at all. A valley supporting animals and fresh water during one generation might become increasingly difficult for descendants. People respond by shifting camps, following herds, moving toward coasts, returning toward better watered regions. Climate does not simply push people like pieces across a board, but it changes the opportunities available. You stop beside an imagined freshwater lake. Birds crowd the shallows. Hoofprints mark the muddy edge. People collect plants near the water. Children play within sight of adults. This does not feel like a migration corridor. It feels like home. That is important. People moving beyond Africa were not necessarily spending every day trying to reach some distant continent. They could settle in suitable places for generations. The great human expansion across the planet may have consisted largely of thousands of temporary endings. Here is good. Stay here. Then circumstances change. Movement begins again. Genetic evidence adds another layer. Most ancestry in present-day populations outside Africa traces largely to an expansion of Homo sapiens that occurred later than the period where your journey began, broadly around 50,000 to 70,000 years ago, although dates and models continue to be refined. Earlier expansions may still have contributed small amounts of ancestry, or left archaeological traces without major surviving genetic legacies. The family tree is not a clean replacement of one wave by another. Some branches vanish, some merge, some leave faint genetic echoes. You walk along an ancient shoreline. Shells crunch beneath your feet. Marine resources may have made coastal routes attractive in some areas because shorelines can offer recurring foods such as shellfish, fish, seabirds, and stranded marine animals. This inspired versions of a coastal dispersal model for human expansion towards southern Asia. But a simple story of people strolling comfortably along one endless beach creates problems. Ancient coastlines are now often underwater because sea levels rose after the Ice Age. Many archaeological sites that could clarify coastal movement may be submerged. Other evidence shows humans also used inland environments, so rather than choosing one perfect route, you imagine flexibility, coast when useful, river when useful, grassland when useful. Move inland when opportunity appears. Human beings are generalists. That may be one of their greatest strengths. They do not need every landscape to provide exactly the same menu. New environments can be learned, new foods tested, old tools adjusted, information shared. The process is slow enough that adaptation can happen culturally as people move. There is also the question of who they meet as populations enter southwestern Asia. Neanderthals are already present across parts of the wider region. Genetic evidence shows that interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals occurred, with major episodes contributing ancestry to later non-African populations. The precise geography and number of encounters remain under investigation. You cannot point to one valley and say, "Here was the meeting," but somewhere people met, not species labels. People, individuals stood within speaking distance of one another. Perhaps they exchanged food, perhaps tools, perhaps nothing at first. Eventually, some formed relationships close enough to leave descendants. Those descendants carried mixed ancestry farther east. The thought stays with you as evening approaches. You settle beside another imagined fire, far from the camp where this journey began. The stars look almost the same. That must have been comforting. Landscapes change, plants change, animals change, languages gradually change. But familiar constellations remain overhead, shifting only slowly across immense spans of time. Someone feeds wood into the flames. A child sleeps beside a bundle. Tomorrow's route is probably no grand mystery to the people here. They may already know where water lies. Perhaps relatives wait several days away. Perhaps animal tracks suggest where to travel next. You understand now that leaving Africa was not one heroic expedition. It was countless ordinary decisions accumulating across generations. And those decisions were made inside a planet that refused to remain stable. Rain belts moved, deserts expanded, lakes appeared and vanished. Sea levels rose and fell. Tomorrow, you will watch those changing climates open doors across the landscape, then quietly close them again during the night. Rain begins touching the ground. At first, it is so light that you mistake it for insects moving through dry vegetation. Then another drop lands on your hand. Another touches your face. Soon you can hear the soft pattern of water falling around the shelter. Nobody seems surprised. You pull your covering closer and listen. Rain is never merely weather in this world. It can decide where people live, over years and generations. Rainfall determines where grass is spread, where lakes fill, where animals gather, and which routes through the landscape remain possible. The Earth of 80,000 years ago is living within the Pleistocene, an epoch marked by repeated climatic shifts. Great ice sheets expand and retreat across northern regions. Temperatures change, ocean levels respond, rainfall belts move. Africa and Arabia feel those changes even when glaciers lie thousands of kilometers away. The planet is connected. Morning reveals darker soil. Water clings to leaves. The smell rising from the ground is rich and earthy, completely different from yesterday's dry dust. You walk toward a shallow depression where water has already begun collecting. Imagine this pattern continuing, not for one night, for centuries. Areas that seem dry and difficult can gradually become greener. Lakes appear, rivers strengthen, grasslands spread into regions that previously offered little food. Herds follow vegetation, predators follow herds, humans follow opportunities. The Sahara itself has repeatedly transformed between desert and much wetter landscapes during Earth's recent geological past. During favourable periods, lakes and river networks dotted areas now dominated by sand and rock. You try to picture the difference. Instead of an enormous barrier, Northern Africa can become a patchwork of habitable corridors. People can move through places that later generations would find nearly impossible to cross. Then orbital cycles slowly alter the climate again. Rain weakens, vegetation retreats, lakes shrink. A route that existed for thousands of years begins closing. Nobody needs to understand planetary astronomy to notice the result. An older person remembers water where a child now sees mud. A hunting area becomes less productive. Animals arrive later. Plants fail. The response begins locally. Move camp closer to reliable water. Stay there longer. Travel farther for food. Visit relatives elsewhere, eventually. What looks to future scientists like a major population movement may begin with something as ordinary as a disappointing season. You continue across the damp ground. There is a useful lesson here. Climate does not command humans. It creates pressures and possibilities. Two groups facing similar drought may respond differently. One moves. Another remains near a permanent spring. A coastal population changes its diet. An inland population follows animals toward higher ground. Social connections can make one route possible while another is avoided. Culture matters alongside environment. That complexity is why simple statements such as climate caused migration rarely tell the whole story. The surviving evidence allows several mechanisms to overlap: rainfall, population size, technology, social networks, competition, curiosity, and chance can all influence movement. Sometimes history happens because several doors open at once. Farther north, enormous amounts of water are stored in ice. This affects a coastline you might never associate with glaciers. When global ice volume increases, sea level falls. During glacial periods, shorelines can move kilometers outward. Shallow seas become exposed land. Islands grow larger. Some straits narrow. Continental shelves that are underwater in your world become plains crossed by animals and people. The map of Earth changes without the continents themselves moving very far. If you could rise high above the planet, coastlines would look unfamiliar. Southeast Asia provides a striking example. When sea levels are low, the Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Java, and Borneo become connected within a much larger landmass called Sunderland. Rivers cross plains that now lie beneath the sea. Animals and humans can move across landscapes where modern travellers require boats. Farther south, Australia and New Guinea are also joined into the larger continent of Sahul, yet deep water remains between Sunderland and Sahul. That gap will become important later. For now, you remain farther west, where shifting climate is repeatedly rearranging human opportunities. There is an unexpectedly personal way to imagine these changes. Think about your favourite familiar path. Perhaps a road home, a street near where you grew up, a route through a neighbourhood. Now imagine that over your lifetime, water slowly disappears from one end, trees die, animals stop appearing. The path remains physically present, but the reasons for using it vanish. That is how environmental change can alter human geography without erecting a wall. Some transformations move in the opposite direction. A previously dry basin fills with fresh water. Birds arrive, plants spread. Large herbivores begin visiting. Suddenly a place avoided by your grandparents becomes attractive to your children. The landscape gains a new road, not a paved one, biological one. By afternoon, the rain has stopped, clouds remain low. You notice small pools reflecting the grey sky. Children investigate them with the universal enthusiasm children display whenever water appears somewhere inconvenient. An adult eventually redirects them. Some historical behaviours require no archaeological proof. Nearby, someone examines the wet ground. Tracks are easier to see now. Weather has changed the information available as well as the resources. You remember your earlier lesson in reading landscapes. A skilled person does not merely know where something is. They know how places behave, which water source survives drought, which valley floods, where animals move after rain, where wind becomes dangerous, which season brings fruit. This kind of knowledge becomes especially valuable in unstable climates. There is another complication. Change does not happen smoothly. Ice core records, marine sediments, cave deposits, lake sediments, pollen, and other natural archives reveal that past climates could shift considerably, sometimes over surprisingly short geological intervals. Scientists reconstruct these worlds by combining many records because no single source tells the entire story. Even then, matching a particular climatic event directly to a particular human migration can be difficult. Dates carry uncertainty. Regional conditions differ. Human populations leave incomplete traces. The past refuses to synchronize its records for modern convenience. You find that strangely appropriate. People living through climate change would not experience a graph. They would experience mornings. One season follows another. Some are generous, some are not. A lake edge moves. A familiar tree stops producing. Someone suggests another camp. Life continues. Evening arrives with cooler air after the rain. The fire is reluctant at first because some fuel has become damp. Smoke thickens. Someone patiently rearranges the wood until the flame strengthens. You sit nearby, watching steam rise from wet material. Tomorrow's world already feels slightly different from yesterday's. That is the deeper pattern. Across thousands of years, human roots expand and contract with changing environments. A green corridor becomes desert, a coastline becomes seabed, a plain becomes forest, a narrow crossing becomes wider. People respond again and again, far to the east. Those responses will eventually carry human populations across southern Asia, not in one march, not according to one map. Generation after generation will enter unfamiliar forests, rivers, coasts, and grasslands. Tonight, the rain has merely changed the smell of the earth. Tomorrow, you will follow that changing earth toward Asia. The rain has left the ground soft beneath your feet. By sunrise, clouds are breaking apart, revealing strips of pale blue sky. Water hangs from leaves every few steps. Droplets fall from branches with tiny taps against the earth. You continue east, not during one lifetime, of course. To follow humanity now, you must allow generations to pass beneath your feet. A child born beside one river grows old beside another. Her grandchildren know a coastline she never saw. Their descendants move through a valley farther east, perhaps following food, relatives, or simply familiar seasonal movements that slowly extend beyond older boundaries. Thousands of small journeys begin forming something enormous. By roughly 50,000 to 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens populations connected to the major ancestry of later non-African peoples were expanding through southern and southwestern Asia. The exact timing differs depending on whether you follow genetics, archaeology, or fossil evidence. Your path is therefore not a single road. It is a broad region of possibilities. You begin somewhere near Arabia. The landscape shifts as centuries pass. Dry interiors alternate with better watered periods. Coastal environments provide shellfish and fish. River valleys draw animals and humans toward fresh water. Some groups may remain near shorelines. Others move inland. You follow whichever path remains open. Eventually, you enter southern Asia. India during the late Pleistocene contains environments ranging from dry grasslands to forests, river systems, uplands, and coastal zones. Human populations entering this enormous region do not encounter an empty stage waiting for them. Other hominin populations may already be present in parts of Asia. Exactly who occupied each region, and when different groups encountered one another, is still being pieced together from scattered fossils, stone industries, and genetic traces. The further east you travel, the less comfortable simple labels become. You stop beside a river, its water moves slowly around exposed stones. Someone crouches at the edge filling a container that may have been made from hide, plant material, shell, or another substance unlikely to survive into your own time. That missing container reminds you how incomplete the archaeological world can be. Imagine trying to reconstruct your own kitchen after everything except the knives had disappeared. Future researchers might conclude that your daily life involved an astonishing amount of cutting. Stone creates a similar illusion in prehistory. People almost certainly carried far more than stone tools: wooden implements, fibre, baskets, cord, hides, food containers, perhaps nets and traps. Most vanish. Human technology was probably softer than the archaeological record makes it look. You continue. Generations pass again. The vegetation thickens. Humidity gathers against your skin. Southeast Asia presents a very different challenge from open African landscapes. Tropical forest can look overwhelmingly abundant. Green leaves everywhere, bird calls, insects, fruit, water. Surely finding food here should be easy. Then you attempt it. Dense forests hide resources vertically and seasonally. Edible plants may be scattered. Animals can be difficult to track through thick vegetation. Familiar African species are gone. New plants require new knowledge. A forest can contain enormous biological richness, while still demanding remarkable skill from a human forager. You hear something moving above. A branch shakes, leaves fall. The animal responsible remains invisible. Excellent. Your breakfast has apparently learned architecture. People adapting to these environments must acquire local knowledge. Which trees fruit when? Where do pigs travel? Which rivers contain useful fish? Which plants are poisonous until processed? Where can dry fuel be found after days of rain? The answers cannot all be carried intact from Africa. This is another kind of human expansion, not simply across geography, across knowledge. Each new environment requires culture to grow. One generation experiments, another remembers, a useful behavior spreads. The toolkit becomes local, along the journey. You occasionally reach open landscapes again. Sea levels are lower than those of your own time, exposing vast areas of continental shelf. Eventually you enter Sunderland. You would not recognize the map. Borneo, Sumatra, Java, and the Malay Peninsula are connected by broad stretches of land during periods of low sea level. You can walk across places where modern ships travel above drowned plains. Rivers flow through those plains toward coastlines lying far beyond today's shores. This creates a peculiar problem for archaeologists. Many camps used by coastal populations may now rest beneath tens of meters of seawater. The evidence has not necessarily vanished. It is simply somewhere extremely inconvenient. You walk along one of those lost rivers. Mud squeezes between your toes, birds gather in the shallows. A child carries something collected from the bank. The group pauses beneath trees. Nothing about this moment announces that you are crossing land future humans will call a seabed. That is the strange privilege of deep time. Continents feel permanent only because human lives are short. The people moving through southern Asia are also encountering unfamiliar animals. During the Pleistocene, parts of this region support elephants, rhinoceroses, wild cattle, deer, pigs, primates, and large carnivores. Some islands contain even stranger evolutionary experiments. On Flores, a small Indonesian island, another human species had lived. Homo floresiensis stood much shorter than modern humans and possessed a surprisingly small brain, yet made stone tools and survived in an island environment for a very long period. Its youngest securely dated remains are generally placed tens of thousands of years before the present, around the broad era when Homo sapiens was spreading through the region. Whether the two populations actually encountered each other remains unresolved. You imagine the possibility without forcing an answer. A group of Homo sapiens reaches unfamiliar territory, across a valley. Smoke rises. Who made it? Another band of your species, a different human population, a natural fire. No surviving witness explains. Flores offers another memorable resident, Stegodon. These elephant relatives included dwarf forms on the island. So this corner of prehistory gives you small humans living alongside relatively small elephant relatives. While giant rats also inhabited Flores, evolution on islands apparently enjoys rearranging expectations. You continue east. Now water becomes increasingly difficult to avoid, even with lowered sea levels connecting much of western Indonesia. Deep channels remain between the Asian land mass and islands farther towards Sahul. Some islands were never joined to the mainland. Reaching them required crossing water. This means people travelling through the region could not simply continue walking forever. At some point, someone faced a shoreline. Land was visible, perhaps, or birds suggested it. Smoke may have appeared in the distance, currents moved between. You stand at the water's edge, waves slide across dark sand. Behind you lie tens of thousands of kilometres of accumulated human movement. Ahead lies a problem that stone points cannot solve. Whatever watercraft people used has almost certainly disappeared. Wood rots, fibre rots, reeds vanish. Yet the presence of humans on islands beyond permanent deep water tells you that crossings happened. Accident alone becomes increasingly difficult to invoke when populations establish themselves successfully. Someone had to reach the other side, likely several someones, enough people to form viable communities. You watch the horizon as evening settles. A seabird moves across the fading sky and disappears eastward. Perhaps someone notices its direction. Perhaps they already know what lies beyond. The sea is dark now. The next stage of your journey will require entering it. Beyond those channels waits Sahul, a continent filled with animals unlike almost anything your travelling companions have known. And sometime in this immense span of forgotten history, humans will cross the water and arrive there. The sea is still there when morning arrives. Dark water has turned silver beneath the early light. Small waves fold onto the shore with a soft, regular sound, each one reaching slightly farther before sliding back across wet sand. You stand near the water and look east. Somewhere beyond the horizon lies another world. Getting there will require something unusual, a crossing. During periods of low Ice Age sea level, much of western Indonesia belonged to the exposed landmass of Sundaland. Farther southeast, Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania formed another enormous landmass known today as Sahul. But Sundaland and Sahul never became completely connected. Deep channels remained between them. Anyone reaching Sahul had to cross water. You imagine the people beside you studying that problem. They possess no compass, no written charts, no weather forecast. Whatever craft they might use must be made from materials available nearby, perhaps wood, bamboo, reeds, vines, or combinations that have left almost no direct archaeological trace. You look around. Nothing on this beach resembles a shipyard. That is probably the wrong image anyway. Early watercraft need not look impressive. They only need to float. Humans had already reached islands requiring sea crossings before the settlement of Sahul. Flores, which you passed yesterday, could not be reached simply by walking from mainland Asia, even during low sea levels. This suggests that water crossings had become part of human experience surprisingly early. How deliberate those earlier voyages were remains difficult to establish. A storm can carry people away accidentally. But repeated movement across multiple channels is another matter. Sahul raises the stakes further because establishing a lasting population requires more than one lucky traveller clinging to driftwood and having a particularly memorable afternoon. Enough people must arrive. They must include individuals capable of forming a viable community. They need tools, knowledge, probably fire, and they must survive after landing. Researchers have used computer simulations of currents, visibility, population size, and possible departure points to explore how such crossings might have worked. Several routes are plausible, and no surviving boat tells you which design carried the first successful groups. The ocean keeps that secret. You step into shallow water. It is warm around your ankles. A wave pushes against your legs. Immediately the crossing feels less abstract. Water removes landmarks. Currents carry you sideways. Weather can change. Fresh water cannot simply be collected along the route. Children make everything more complicated. So do sharp stone tools on something designed to float. You suddenly appreciate the modern ferry. Eventually. You imagine leaving shore. The craft beneath you creaks or bends. Perhaps several people travel together. Bundles are secured. Someone watches the direction of waves. Another watches birds. Clouds gather over distant land that may sometimes be visible from elevated points or revealed by atmospheric signs. Knowledge of sea behavior could accumulate just as knowledge of tracks did back in Africa. Currents have patterns. Winds have seasons. Birds leave land and return. Clouds can form over islands. Floating vegetation may suggest nearby rivers. You do not need a map if the environment provides other clues. Still, the water feels enormous. Hours pass in imagination. Then the horizon changes. Land. The reaction among the travellers is impossible to recover. Relief seems reasonable. Perhaps there is excitement. Perhaps they have made this crossing before and nobody considers it extraordinary. History often labels something a first, while the people doing it simply call it Tuesday. You approach shore. The world you enter is Sahul. Humans reached this combined Australia and New Guinea landmass at least around 50,000 years ago. An evidence from sites such as Majed Bebe in northern Australia has been interpreted as indicating occupation by about 65,000 years ago. That earlier chronology has generated extensive discussion about dating, site formation, and how it fits with genetic models. You do not need to solve the chronology tonight. The larger point is secure. Humans reached Sahul astonishingly early, and they could only do so across water. Your feet touch land again. Everything smells different. Vegetation changes. Bird calls are unfamiliar. The animals belong to ecosystems that had evolved in long isolation. Sahul contains marsupials of extraordinary variety. Some are much larger than their modern relatives. You might encounter giant kangaroos. There are enormous wombat relatives such as Diprotodon, one of the largest marsupials ever known. Powerful predators also inhabit this world. Thylacoleo, often called the marsupial lion, possesses formidable adaptations for hunting. Giant monitor lizards roam parts of the continent. Large, flightless birds occupy other ecological roles. For newcomers, these are not museum exhibits, they are neighbours. You imagine the first weeks. Everything must be learned again. Which water is dependable? Which plants are edible? How do local animals behave? Where does useful stone occur? What burns well? Which landscapes become dangerous after rain? The skills developed across Africa and Asia remain valuable. But local knowledge must begin almost from zero. This is what makes human adaptability so impressive. People do not carry one fixed way of living across the planet. They carry the ability to learn. Soon, stone tools are being made from local materials. Fire burns beneath unfamiliar trees. Children grow up knowing this place better than the adults who first arrived. Within a generation, foreign landscape becomes homeland. There is an unusual detail hidden in that transformation. The ancestors of Aboriginal Australians and Papuan peoples preserve some of the deepest continuous population histories outside Africa. Genetic evidence indicates very ancient ancestry in Sahul, although later movements and complex regional histories also shaped populations. The people landing here are not merely visiting the edge of human range. Their descendants will maintain cultural traditions in these landscapes across immense stretches of time. You walk inland, a river moves through vegetation. Someone ahead stops to examine tracks. You recognize the gesture immediately. Different continent, same human habit. The ground becomes readable. A plant is inspected. Stone is tested. A child watches. A fire is prepared before darkness. The continuity is almost comforting. Thousands of kilometers from the African camp where your journey started, the same basic pattern returns. Observe, learn, share, remember, adapt. The question of what happened between humans and Sahul's giant animals is more complicated. Many large species disappeared during the late Pleistocene. Human hunting, landscape burning, climatic change, and combinations of these factors have all been examined as possible explanations. Timing differs among species and regions, and the evidence does not reduce neatly to one cause. You resist turning the arrival into a simple story of destruction for the people beside you. Tonight is about staying alive in unfamiliar country. The fire is small. Food is being prepared. Beyond the light, large animals move through vegetation. Someone points toward a sound. Another person listens. No one knows that future scientists will spend careers reconstructing this evening from fragments. You sit near the flames. Behind you lies the water crossing. Beyond you stretches an entire continent. Yet the greatest surprise is how quickly extraordinary achievements become ordinary life. A voyage becomes a remembered route. A strange animal receives a familiar meaning. A foreign plant becomes food. A new river gains a name you will never hear clearly enough to remember. Generations settle. Children are born who have never seen the lands to the west. For them, this is simply home. You look into the fire as darkness settles over Sahul. Humans have travelled astonishingly far. And still, civilization is nowhere in sight. No agriculture, no cities, no writing. Thousands upon thousands of years remain before any of them appear. Tomorrow, you will pause inside that enormous silence and confront perhaps the strangest part of the entire human story. How much history happened before anyone thought to write it down? The fire in Sahul burns quietly through the night. By morning, nothing monumental has happened. No city has been founded. No king has been crowned. No monument has risen from the ground. Nobody has invented writing. And yet another day of human history has passed. You sit beside the fading embers and allow that thought to settle. Around 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had already spread across enormous distances. Human communities lived in Africa, southwestern Asia, southern Asia, Southeast Asia, and Sahel, other human populations, including Neanderthals and Denisovan-related groups, still occupied parts of Eurasia. People possessed fire. They made sophisticated tools. They exchanged materials. They decorated bodies. They adapted to deserts, forests, grasslands, mountains, rivers, and coastlines. But civilization, in the sense modern people usually imagine it, didn't exist. Agriculture was still tens of thousands of years away. Writing lay farther ahead. There were no states, formal bureaucracies, coins, armies maintained by governments, or streets lined with permanent shops. If history books began here, they would require an unusual amount of blank paper. That blankness would be misleading. You rise and follow the camp into another ordinary morning. Someone collects fuel. Someone prepares food. A tool needs repair. Children follow adults toward water. These activities leave fewer dramatic traces than palaces, but they occupy far more of human existence. For most of the time Homo sapiens has existed, people lived as hunters and gatherers. Agricultural societies are comparatively recent. Industrial society occupies only the thinnest edge of the timeline. If the entire existence of Homo sapiens were compressed into a single day, cities and writing would appear extremely late. Your smartphone would arrive so close to midnight that it would barely have time to demand an update. The people walking beside you are therefore not standing outside human history. They represent its normal condition for an immense span of time. You move with them through the landscape. A child notices tracks. An adult examines them. Another person digs for plant food. Nothing here is static. That matters because phrases such as Stone Age can create the impression that people spent thousands of generations doing exactly the same thing. They did not. Technologies changed. Populations moved. Climate shifted. Social networks expanded and contracted. New materials were used. Styles appeared and disappeared. Knowledge accumulated in some places and was lost in others. There was no single prehistoric culture. Africa alone contained enormous environmental and cultural diversity. The same was true across Eurasia and, increasingly, Sahel. A person living on a southern African coast did not experience the same daily world as someone living near a Siberian river. Their food differed, their clothing differed, their animals differed, their seasonal routines differed, probably their stories, languages, customs, and social expectations differed too. You begin moving forward through time, not quickly. Imagine each step carrying you several generations. The fire behind you disappears, another replaces it, then another. Children become grandparents, their grandchildren grow old. Languages shift so gradually that nobody notices. A pronunciation changes, a word is shortened, a new expression spreads after enough generations. Speech that once sounded familiar may become difficult to understand. No written dictionary preserves the older form. The same can happen with stories. A remembered event changes slightly with each telling. Some details remain, others disappear. New meanings attach themselves. Entire worlds of oral tradition can rise and vanish without leaving a readable sentence behind. This is perhaps the greatest hidden archive in human history. Lost conversation. Think of how much information passes through your own life without being written down. Family jokes, childhood memories, advice, arguments, nicknames, stories told at dinner. Now multiply that by thousands of generations. Almost all of it is gone. Archaeology catches fragments around the edges. A hearth, a bead, a footprint, a broken point, a patch of pigment, a butchered bone, a layer of bedding. From these, researchers reconstruct patterns, but the personalities remain mostly silent. You cannot know who was considered funny, who sang beautifully, who disliked waking early, who always found water, who told stories too slowly, who was unusually patient with children. The absence of writing removes names, but it does not remove individuality. At another camp, you watch someone working a shell into an ornament nearby. Another person produces a stone tool using a method slightly different from what you saw earlier. Styles can carry information. Archaeologists sometimes identify regional traditions through recurring patterns in tools and ornaments. But interpreting those differences is complicated. A style might indicate shared identity, or simply a useful technique. Similar objects can be invented independently. Different objects can perform similar tasks. Material culture gives hints about social boundaries without providing a membership list. Still, something is happening across these enormous spans. Human communities are becoming increasingly capable of maintaining connections over distance. Materials sometimes travel far from their sources. Ornaments appear. Technologies spread. These networks may provide protection against local shortages if your group knows people beyond the next valley. A drought does not necessarily isolate you. You may visit them, exchange resources, form partnerships, learn about conditions elsewhere. Social relationships become part of environmental survival. The landscape contains people as well as food. You remember the small band from the beginning of your journey. Their strength came from cooperation within the camp. Now you can expand that idea. Groups can cooperate with groups. Not always peacefully, of course. Competition must also have existed. Territories could overlap. Resources could become scarce. People could distrust outsiders. Evidence for interpersonal violence appears in parts of prehistory. Although patterns vary greatly and should not be projected uniformly across every population, the deeper record does not support a simple picture of either permanent harmony or permanent warfare. Humans are more complicated than either story. Fortunately for bedtime purposes, tonight's camp is quiet. You sit beside a person repairing a tool. The repetitive scraping sound is almost hypnotic. Scrape, turn, inspect. Scrape again. A child sleeps nearby. Smoke moves through the cool air. You allow another 10,000 years to pass. The number is almost impossible to feel. 10,000 years ago from your own time, entire familiar civilizations had not yet appeared. Now imagine that duration passing repeatedly while humans continue living, experimenting, moving, remembering, and adapting. This is the hidden scale of prehistory. History classes often hurry through it because there are few names and dates to memorize. Then agriculture appears and suddenly the pages become crowded. Villages, kings, battles, taxes. Apparently paperwork is what finally convinces history to slow down. But you are not rushing. You remain with the forgotten majority. By around 50,000 to 40,000 years ago, Homo sapiens is expanding farther into Eurasia. New archaeological traditions appear across different regions. Personal ornaments become more visible at many sites. Technologies diversify. Neanderthals are still present. The human world remains plural. Soon, your journey will enter colder country. You will need the lessons already learned. Fire, shelter, clothing, cooperation, tools, memory. Because beyond the warmer landscapes lies Ice Age Eurasia, where winter can reshape almost every part of daily life. You look once more at the quiet camp. Nobody here knows that they are living through an age future people will call prehistoric. They simply prepare for tomorrow. And tomorrow, in your journey, the air will become much colder. The cold reaches you before the landscape fully changes. It begins as a sharper edge in the morning air. Your breath becomes visible. Grass feels stiff beneath your feet. Small patches of frost remain in shaded places after sunrise. and the covering around your shoulders suddenly seems less like an optional comfort and more like essential equipment. You have travelled north and west through generations. By roughly 45,000 years ago, Homo sapiens populations were established across significant parts of Eurasia. They entered a world already occupied by Neanderthals and shaped by the unstable climates of the late Pleistocene. This is Ice Age Europe and Northern Asia, but do not picture the entire continent buried beneath a single endless sheet of ice. Glaciers dominate some northern regions and mountain systems, while farther south lie tundra, steppe, woodland, river valleys, and open grasslands. These environments shift repeatedly as temperatures and rainfall change. The landscape can be cold without being frozen solid, and much of it is full of life. You walk across open ground beneath a pale sky. In the distance, animals move, large ones. Mammoths inhabit parts of this world, alongside woolly rhinoceroses, horses, reindeer, bison, deer, and other mammals adapted to cooler environments. Predators are present too. Cave lions roam Eurasia. Wolves travel across large territories. Hyenas occupy some regions. Brown bears and cave bears use landscapes humans also enter. You feel considerably less impressed with your position in the food chain. Fortunately, you're not alone. That lesson has followed you all the way from Africa. People survive here through cooperation, technology, knowledge, and the ability to reshape their immediate surroundings. Clothing becomes especially important by later Ice Age periods. Archaeological evidence clearly demonstrates increasingly sophisticated hideworking and eventually eyed needles, allowing fitted garments to be sewn. Earlier clothing is harder to reconstruct because hide and fibre usually disappear. Still, humans entering cold environments could not behave as though temperature were merely a minor inconvenience. You imagine layers of animal skin around your body. The outer surface blocks wind, fur traps air. Your feet need protection too. Hands become difficult to use when numb. A loose covering that worked beside a mild African fire is less satisfying when cold wind moves across an open Eurasian plain. You suddenly understand why tailoring can become survival technology. Shelter changes as well. Caves and rock shelters provide valuable protection where available, but humans do not restrict themselves to landscapes conveniently equipped with caves. Open-air sites show occupation far from natural shelters. Structures made from wood, hides, vegetation, bone, or combinations of these materials could create temporary protection. Later Ice Age sites famously preserve structures incorporating mammoth bones. The site is memorable enough that it can distort your expectations. You might imagine everyone building elegant circular mammoth bone houses. They were not. Such structures belong to particular regions and later periods. Still, they reveal something important. Humans can turn even the remains of enormous animals into architecture. Nothing useful needs to be wasted. You approach a camp. Smoke escapes into the cold air. The smell reaches you before the warmth does. Inside the sheltered area, the difference is immediate. Wind weakens, bodies create heat, a fire burns low. Someone works on a hide. Another person adjusts a stone edge. Children occupy the warmest protected spaces with the impressive efficiency. Children still demonstrate when blankets are available. You settle near the hearth. Your fingers slowly stop aching. Food presents another challenge. Cold environments can offer enormous quantities of animal resources, but availability changes with migration and season. Reindeer herds move. Horses shift across grasslands. Plants become scarce during colder months. Knowing animal behavior can therefore become as important as knowing geography. A successful hunt may provide meat, fat, hide, sinew, bone, antler, and other materials. Fat is especially valuable. Lean meat contains protein, But humans cannot comfortably meet all energy needs through unlimited protein alone. Fat provides concentrated calories in cold environments. That energy matters. You find yourself looking at a prehistoric meal with new respect. It may not be beautifully seasoned, it may not come with bread, but your body is far less interested in presentation than in calories. Someone cracks a bone. Inside is marrow. There is one of the quieter advantages of understanding animal anatomy. Food exists in places a casual observer might discard. Marrow, organs, fat deposits. Every part has potential value. Archaeologists studying cut marks, broken bones, hearths, and animal remains can reconstruct portions of these processing behaviors. But one site can represent a brief stop, repeated occupation, a hunting location, or something entirely different. A pile of bones needs context before it becomes a story. Outside, snow begins falling, only lightly. Small flakes disappear when they reach the warmer ground near the fire. You watch them through the opening. Someone beside you is working antler. This material can become points and other tools. Bone, antler, and ivory technologies become increasingly visible in Upper Paleolithic contexts. These materials behave differently from stone. They can be carved, scraped, polished, and shaped into long forms difficult to create from brittle rock. A toolkit becomes more diverse because people understand the properties of different materials. There is elegance here, not elegance for display necessarily. Elegance in solving problems. A sharp stone cuts hide. A bone implement pierces it. Sinew can bind it. Hide blocks wind. Fire warms the shelter. One solution supports another. You remember the compound tools from Africa. The principle has travelled with you. Outside, the snow thickens slightly. You decide not to investigate. This may be the wisest prehistoric decision you have made. Instead, you listen. Someone is speaking, perhaps telling a story. The language is different from the one you imagined in Africa thousands of years earlier. It may have changed beyond recognition many times, yet the social function remains familiar. People sit together while darkness grows outside. Knowledge passes. Children listen. Someone laughs. A tool continues scraping quietly in the corner. The people here may also maintain relationships with groups living considerable distances away. Materials found at Ice Age sites sometimes originate far from their source areas. Shell ornaments can appear inland. Particular stones travel across landscapes. Whether every object move through direct journeys, exchanges, gifts, or several intermediate groups cannot always be established. But the distances tell you that the social world extends beyond the camp. That matters when conditions have become difficult. A local resource can fail. Animals may shift route. Weather can become severe. Knowing other people elsewhere creates options. Survival is partly geographic, partly technological, and partly social. The cold world encourages mobility rather than ending it. Homo sapiens continues spreading. Eventually people occupy environments reaching toward the Arctic. The ability of a tropical primate lineage to accomplish this is extraordinary when you stop thinking of adaptation only as biological evolution. Humans carry miniature environments around themselves. Clothing creates warmth against skin. Shelter creates calmer air. Fire creates a pocket of heat. Food storage and sharing stretch resources across time. Culture becomes a portable habitat. You lie down as the fire settles. Outside, snow softens the landscape. Animal tracks will appear clearly tomorrow. The camp grows quiet. You have crossed from African grasslands to Eurasian cold without growing fur, claws, or a thicker hide. Instead, generations accumulated knowledge. And as you listen to the wind moving gently beyond the shelter, you realize that these adaptations will eventually support something new. People will begin returning to certain places more often. Resources will be stored. Seasonal camps will become increasingly important. Plants and animals will be observed with extraordinary attention, slowly, almost invisibly. Some communities will begin approaching a different relationship with the land. Tomorrow, you will follow that long road towards settled life. The snow disappears gradually behind you. You do not leave it in a single journey. Instead, centuries pass, climates shift, and generations move through landscapes that repeatedly change around them. Eventually, the air becomes warmer. You find yourself beside a broad patch of grass beneath a clear morning sky. Seeds cling to dry stalks. Birds move through the vegetation, occasionally disappearing into it before rising again. Someone beside you reaches down and gathers a handful. This action looks almost too ordinary to deserve attention, yet you have arrived near one of the longest transformations in human history. The road towards settled life does not begin when someone suddenly invents farming. It begins much earlier. People have always observed plants. A forager needs to know when seeds ripen, where useful roots grow, how rainfall affects fruiting, and which places produce food reliably. Those lessons can accumulate across generations. By the later Pleistocene, human communities in many regions were developing increasingly detailed ways of exploiting particular environments. Some returned repeatedly to favored locations. Others moved seasonally between several camps. Mobility did not simply vanish. It became patterned. You follow a group toward water. The route is familiar to them. They have walked it before, near the camp. You notice objects that would have been inconvenient to carry across enormous distances. Grinding stones, heavy tools. Storage facilities appear in some later prehistoric contexts as well. These things suggest a different relationship with place. A mobile person can own heavy objects, of course. But there comes a point when carrying a large grinding stone everywhere begins to feel like a punishment invented by history. Leaving useful equipment at a place you expect to revisit makes sense. Return changes everything. A campsite can accumulate memory. There is the hearth used last season. There is the good source of water. There is the patch where edible plants grow. There is the tree that provides shade in summer. Landscape becomes schedule. You sit near someone processing seeds. Grinding creates a soft, repetitive sound. Stone against stone. Pause, then again. Plant foods have always been part of human diets, but intensive processing can make small seeds and tough materials more useful. Grinding breaks them down. Cooking transforms them further. Containers allow boiling, soaking, or storage once suitable technologies are available. The history of food is partly the history of discovering ways to eat things that initially seem determined not to become dinner. You watch fine material gather on the stone. Later, archaeologists will sometimes find microscopic starch grains trapped on ancient grinding surfaces. Something almost invisible can reveal meals prepared thousands of years earlier. The thought is oddly intimate. A person grinds food. Dust settles into tiny spaces. Time passes. The meal disappears. The dust remains farther west. Much later in your journey, communities in the Levant begin showing especially clear signs of increased sedentism before full agriculture. The Natufian culture, beginning roughly 15,000 years ago, includes settlements with substantial structures, grinding equipment, sickle blades, burials, ornaments, and intensive use of wild cereals and other resources. These people are not yet simply farmers in the later village sense. That distinction matters. Permanent or semi-permanent settlement can develop before domesticated crops completely transform the economy. You enter one of these later landscapes. Stone structures sit partly sunk into the ground. Smoke rises. People move between work areas. Dogs may be present. The relationship between humans and wolves has roots much deeper than farming. and domesticated dogs were living with people before agriculture became established. So one of humanity's earliest animal partners did not begin as livestock. It began somewhere inside the long hunter-gatherer world. You imagine a dog resting near the edge of camp, opening one eye whenever food is handled. Some partnerships apparently achieve perfection early. The settlement feels different from the temporary camps you knew. There are more possessions, more repeated activity in one place. Storage becomes increasingly valuable. If food is seasonal, collecting a surplus can help bridge periods when less is available, but stored food creates new problems. It must be protected from moisture. Insects discover it. Rodents discover it. Other humans may discover it. A granary is therefore not merely a box containing dinner, it represents planning. Work performed now for people who will be hungry later. The same principle existed in simpler forms earlier, but increasing dependence on stored resources can reshape daily life. You begin noticing the plants differently too. When people repeatedly gather wild cereals, they make choices. Which stands are harvested, which seeds are collected. Where are useful plants encouraged? At some point, cultivation enters the story. People begin deliberately tending or planting species that had once been gathered entirely from wild populations. There is no universal moment when everyone agrees agriculture has begun. The transition takes different forms in different regions. In southwestern Asia, domestication of crops such as wheat and barley emerges through a prolonged process beginning near the end of the Pleistocene and continuing into the early Holocene. The plants themselves gradually change. Wild cereal ears are adapted to scatter seeds when mature. That is excellent for the plant. It is less convenient for a person trying to harvest them. When humans repeatedly collect and sow seeds from plants whose ears remain intact longer, they can unintentionally favor traits useful for cultivation, generation after generation. Human behavior alters plant evolution. Nobody needs to understand genetics. The field changes anyway. You hold a few grains in your palm. They look insignificant. Yet this new relationship between people and plants will eventually support populations far larger than those of most mobile foraging communities. That does not mean agriculture is simply an improvement. The story becomes more complicated. Farming can provide abundant calories, but dependence on a narrower range of foods may reduce dietary diversity. Living in larger, denser settlements can increase exposure to infectious disease. Workloads change. Social inequality can grow. Dental problems can become more common in some farming populations. Early farmers did not necessarily become healthier simply because they produced more food. Why, then, did agriculture spread? There is no single answer that works everywhere. Population pressures may have mattered in some places. Climate change altered the distribution of wild resources. Local experimentation created new opportunities. Storage and sedentary life could reinforce cultivation. Once communities invested heavily in particular landscapes, moving away became more costly. Several processes could strengthen one another without anyone planning a revolution. You look toward the horizon. The Ice Age is ending. Global temperatures are moving into the warmer Holocene. Sea levels rise as ice sheets melt. Forests expand in some regions. Animal distributions change. Human communities respond in different ways. Some become farmers. Many remain hunter-gatherers. Others combine cultivation, herding, fishing, hunting, and gathering in flexible mixtures. There is never one human timetable. Even thousands of years after agriculture begins, mobile foraging societies continue thriving across enormous regions. You return to the settlement as evening falls. Food is stored. Grinding stones rest beside walls. A dog curls near the fire. Someone repairs a basket. Children move through spaces their grandparents may also have known. For the first time in your journey, place itself seems to be acquiring a stronger hold on people. You remember the camp 80,000 years ago. Everything needed to travel could be gathered and carried. Here, leaving would mean abandoning more structures, stored food, heavy equipment, cultivated ground, perhaps graves. Memory has become anchored. Tomorrow, you will stand near the threshold where villages grow larger, agriculture spreads, and eventually writing begins. But before entering that noisy world, you will turn around. Behind you stretch tens of thousands of years almost entirely without written names. The forgotten majority of the human story is waiting for one final look. Morning settles gently over the settlement. Smoke rises from several hearths, thin and pale against the brightening sky. Somewhere nearby, stone touches stone with a familiar grinding sound. A dog stretches beside a wall and circles twice before deciding that waking fully is unnecessary. You understand the feeling for a while. You remain beside the fire. Behind you lies an almost unimaginable distance, not simply distance across land, distance through human lives. You began around 80,000 years ago beside a small African camp where people gathered food, shaped stone, watched children, maintained fires, and read a landscape without maps. Since then, generations have carried you outward, across changing African environments, toward Arabia, through southern Asia, across drowned landscapes of Southeast Asia, over water into Sahul, north into the cold worlds of Eurasia, and finally toward communities where people return repeatedly to the same ground, store food, cultivate plants, and build increasingly permanent homes. Now you stand near the threshold of another world. Agriculture will spread through many regions. Villages will grow. Some will become towns. Animals will be domesticated in new relationships with humans. Surplus food will support specialists who do not spend every day producing their own meals. Trade networks will lengthen. Property will become more complicated. Leadership will take new forms eventually. Cities will rise. Then writing appears in Mesopotamia. The earliest known writing systems emerged during the late 4th millennium BCE, initially connected closely with administration, accounting, goods, and institutions. After tens of thousands of years without written records, humanity finally begins leaving words. And what are some of the earliest surviving written concerns? Grain, livestock, labor, quantities. Apparently, one of civilization's great breakthroughs was discovering that somebody needed to keep track of the barley. There is something wonderfully human about that. Writing will eventually preserve poetry, laws, prayers, letters, scientific ideas, royal boasts, jokes, complaints, and stories. But some of its earliest uses are intensely practical. Who has what? How much? Where did it go? You look backward again. Writing changes your relationship with the past because suddenly individuals begin speaking more directly. Names survive, transactions survive, rulers identify themselves, scribes record events, dates become increasingly precise. History starts becoming crowded with voices. That abundance can create an illusion. It can make everything before writing seem like a waiting room, as though humans spent tens of thousands of years quietly preparing for the moment someone invented administration. But your journey has shown you something different. Civilization did not create human complexity. It reorganized complexity that was already ancient, long before cities. Humans maintained social relationships. Long before written maps, they navigated enormous landscapes before formal schools. Knowledge passed between generations. Before shops, people exchanged materials over distance. Before scientific chemistry, they understood practical transformations involving fire, pigment, adhesives, food, stone, hide, and plants. before architecture became monumental. People built shelters. Before medicine became a profession, communities cared for injured and dependent individuals. Before written stories, voices carried memory. You remember the fires. That may be the image that connects everything. A fire in Africa, another in Arabia, another somewhere along an Asian river, another in Seoul, another beneath a cold Eurasian sky. The people beside those fires never met. Their languages differed, their environments differed. Thousands of years separated some of them. Yet each small circle of light represented a human solution to darkness. You begin walking away from the settlement. The path leads uphill. From there, you can see the surrounding country more clearly. Fields have not yet swallowed the entire landscape. Wild plants still grow beyond human activity. Animals move through distant vegetation. People remain close to a world that has supported humans for countless generations. Agriculture will alter that relationship. But not everywhere and not immediately. Even after cities appear, millions of people will continue living through hunting, gathering, fishing, herding, cultivation, or mixtures of several strategies. Human history never advances as one synchronized line. Different ways of life overlap. They always have. This makes the phrase Stone Age seem increasingly inadequate. Stone was important, but so was wood, fiber, hide, bone, fire, language, memory, social obligation. None fits neatly into a museum display case. The most important prehistoric technologies may sometimes have been invisible. Trust, teaching, cooperation, the ability to imagine something not currently present, the willingness to share information, a remembered route, a story warning children about danger. These leave almost no direct artifact, yet without them, the stone points would tell only part of the story. You stop on the hillside. Wind moves through the grass. The sound resembles the first landscape you entered so long ago. That feels appropriate. There is still one major question waiting. Why do we talk so little about these tens of thousands of years? Part of the answer is simple. Narrative prefers names. It prefers dates. It prefers events with clear beginnings and endings. A battle occurs on a particular day. A ruler dies. A city falls. A document is signed. Prehistory rarely gives you that convenience. Instead, it gives you processes. Population movements lasting centuries. Technologies changing across generations. Languages disappearing without records. Climate shifting slowly enough that nobody experiences the entire transformation. One family living an ordinary life does not look like a historical turning point. Multiply that family by 10,000 generations and the world changes. Archaeology therefore works with different kinds of evidence. A hearth can reveal repeated occupation. Teeth can preserve chemical signatures connected with diet and movement. Ancient DNA can expose meetings between populations no written source remembers. Pollen can reconstruct vegetation. Shells can reveal environmental conditions. Microscopic residues can identify plants processed on tools. Footprints can preserve a few seconds of movement. One particularly intimate example comes from prehistoric footprints found at sites around the world. A footprint does not simply tell you that humans existed. Sometimes size and spacing suggest adults and children moving together for one brief moment. Deep history becomes a walk. You can almost follow, but interpretation remains careful. A footprint cannot tell you what the walker was thinking. A burial cannot automatically reveal a complete religion. An ornament cannot explain its symbolism. DNA can reveal ancestry without preserving identity. There will always be a boundary between evidence and imagination. That boundary does not make prehistory less meaningful. It makes humility part of the journey. You turn back toward the settlement. Evening is beginning to gather. The light becomes warmer. Smoke hangs close to the ground. Someone calls a child toward the fire. The child runs back for a moment. You think about the billions of ordinary moments that disappeared completely. Meals nobody recorded, journeys nobody mapped, friendships without names, songs without notation, children whose laughter survives nowhere, people who watch sunsets and worried about tomorrow. Their individual stories are mostly gone. Their consequences are not. They carried knowledge forward. They adapted. They survived, eventually, through countless branching lines of ancestry. Their world became yours. The distance between you and them is enormous. The connection is equally enormous. And now, as the final fire of your journey begins glowing in the evening light, there is nowhere else you need to travel. You can simply sit. The long road behind you is quiet. The night is coming. The fire settles lower, and the voices around it soften. You have walked through 50,000 years that no written witness could describe. Now the details begin to fade. The shoreline grows distant. The cold plain disappears beneath darkness. The old African grass moves gently beneath a night wind. You no longer need to follow every footprint. You no longer need to remember every date. You can allow the entire journey to become softer around the edges. Somewhere, an ancient fire gives a quiet crack. Someone adds one last piece of wood. A child is already asleep nearby. Above them, the same stars that crossed your journey remain bright and patient. Generations pass beneath those stars. People arrive, people leave, their footsteps disappear, their fires become ash, their voices fade. But something continues forward, a technique remembered, a meal shared, a route taught, a child protected through another cold night. No one person needs to carry the whole human story. Each carries only a small part, and then quietly gives it onward. You can rest with that thought. The distant sounds become gentler now. The grinding stone has stopped. The dog beside the shelter is sleeping. Smoke rises almost straight upward because the wind has weakened. You settle closer to the warmth. Nothing is waiting for you beyond the fire tonight. No migration, no cold crossing, no unfamiliar continent. Only the slow breathing of sleeping people and the faint orange glow of embers. Thousands of years can pass without disturbing you. Cities may rise somewhere far beyond this quiet place. Writing may eventually fill tablets and pages. Names may begin entering history. But here, for one final moment, none of that is necessary. The world is dark. The fire is warm. Human beings are together. And the oldest part of the story can finally become still. Sweet dreams.